It began like any other British winter, grey skies, damp boots, and a collective sigh that could fog an entire city block. But by January 1908, it became clear that this was no ordinary chill. This was nature on strike, the sort of cold that didn't just nip your fingers, it filed a formal complaint against your existence. Across Edwardian Britain, the world seemed to have frozen in place. Rivers turned into crystal highways, trees stood glittering and stiff like over-decorated Christmas guests who had overstayed their welcome, and entire towns disappeared under blankets of frost so thick they might as well have been gift-wrapped by the Arctic itself. It was so cold even gossip froze mid-air, and that's saying something for the Edwardians. In an age when reputation was everything, a frozen rumour might have been the only thing keeping half of London polite. The endless winter of 1908 crept in quietly, like an unwelcome house guest who didn't understand subtle hints. December brought whispers of snow. January brought despair. And by February it felt like Britain had been relocated to somewhere between the North Pole and Purgatory. Hello, travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. The newspapers did their best to sound upbeat. A charming frost grips the nation, while omitting the fact that charming frost was currently strangling railways, freezing crops, and turning milkmen into ice sculptures. The River Thames, which hadn't fully frozen since the days of Dickens, began showing signs of solid rebellion again. Barges got stuck midstream, their crews forced to chip away at the ice just to move an inch, like desperate contestants in some frozen endurance game. Children laughed and threw snowballs, while adults quietly worried that spring might have been cancelled for budgetary reasons. Londoners trudged through slush that froze solid by nightfall, turning pavements into glass slides of doom. Hats blew off, gloves vanished, and every breath felt like inhaling disappointment. Meanwhile, chimneys puffed so much smoke that the skyline looked permanently disgruntled. The great empire, so proud of its machinery and progress, suddenly realised that steam engines don't steam very well when everything's frozen solid. Trains stalled on tracks, passengers huddling for warmth like penguins who had paid for first class. Letters arrived weeks late. Not that anyone could hold a pen without their ink freezing halfway through a complaint. In the countryside, it was worse. Farmers watched helplessly as livestock shivered themselves into legend. Chickens laid what might have been frozen omelettes, while cows produced milk so cold it could have doubled as ice cream. The soil turned to concrete, and even the most optimistic farmer started to suspect that spring thaw might just be another Edwardian euphemism for wishful thinking. Inside the cities, life adapted in the usual British way, with grim humour and unnecessary politeness. People greeted each other with chattering teeth and lines like, "Bit chilly, isn't it?" as if understatement could thaw the air. Chimney sweeps worked overtime, coal deliveries became more competitive than Wimbledon finals. Those who could afford it ordered extra coal and felt momentarily superior. Those who couldn't learned that multiple layers of wool could substitute for pride, if not for actual body heat. And through it all, the social hierarchy remained as rigid as the icicles dangling from Parliament. The upper class retreated to drawing rooms lined with velvet and hubris, sipping tea beside roaring fires and complaining about how difficult it was to find fresh flowers for the centrepiece. The working poor, meanwhile, faced nights so cold that sleep became an act of bravery. Many warmed their hands over shared street fires, exchanging both body heat and grievances in equal measure. But perhaps the most poetic part of this frozen saga was how quiet everything became. The usual clatter of carriages and chatter of city life dulled beneath layers of snow. Even London, noisy, relentless London, fell into a kind of enchanted silence. You could hear the crunch of boots from half a street away. Street lamps glowed like watchful eyes through the mist, their light refracted through frozen air. For once, the empire that never stopped talking actually paused to listen, mostly to the sound of its own teeth chattering. Yet there was beauty in the misery. painfully frost-bitten beauty. The countryside sparkled like glass. Rivers reflected sunlight in shards of brilliance. And window panes bloomed with delicate ice patterns so intricate they could have been designed by an underpaid artist. Couples strolled arm in arm, pretending they were enjoying the picturesque winter, though both silently plotted murder over who got the warmer glove. Artists painted the scenes, poets romanticised them, and photographers risked losing fingers to capture them. Proof that Britain could still find beauty in disaster, as long as it looked good in sepia. By March, people began to realise that endless winter might not be an exaggeration. The frost refused to budge, and the word thaw began to sound like an ancient myth. Still, Edwardians being Edwardians, they adapted. They learned to boil water before it froze, wrap themselves like mummies, and complain eloquently about the weather in at least 3 complete sentences. The great irony was that while technology, empire and progress had carried Britain to dizzying new heights, one old-fashioned enemy, plain old cold, brought it all crashing down to basics. It didn't matter if you were a duke or a dock worker. Frost was the great equaliser. And as icicles hung from lampposts like nature's chandeliers, one truth became clear. The Edwardians weren't just battling winter. They were battling the limits of comfort itself. Because when the world froze solid, civilization didn't stop. It just shivered a lot more loudly. The forecast was simple: snow, frost and regret. Britain in 908 wasn't merely enduring a cold spell, it was being emotionally bullied by the atmosphere. It was as if the sky itself had decided that the empire needed humbling and unleashed a meteorological mood swing so violent that even the most patriotic weatherman considered emigrating to Spain. The winter of 1908 was meteorology's equivalent of a midlife crisis. Arctic winds swept down like they'd lost patience with Scandinavia, and Britain, poor thing, was in the way. The cold didn't just arrive, it arrived dramatically. Temperatures plummeted faster than Edwardian stock portfolios during a moral panic, and even coastal towns that usually got by with mild frosts found themselves buried in snowdrifts so high they could have applied for mountain status. The newspapers described it in flowery language, because British journalism has always believed that adjectives can fix suffering. A season of glittering majesty, one paper called it, carefully avoiding the fact that said majesty had frozen the water main solid and caused horses to skate down to Fleet Street. A wintry marvel of rare severity, another chimed, as if trying to sell tickets to misery. Behind these poetic flourishes, meteorologists quietly recorded record lows, -10, -15, -20 in some rural corners. Even the sea seemed to sulk. Harbours along the Thames estuary glazed over, trapping small ships like sardines in a block of national inconvenience. Weather maps of the time looked less like forecasts and more like battle plans. You could practically see the front lines of frost pushing south, advancing with all the determination of an invading army. Scotland took the first hit, of course, and by the time the cold reached London, it had developed a sense of purpose. The wind howled down city streets like a ghost with unfinished business, rattling windows and rearranging hats with vicious enthusiasm. Telegraph lines froze into stiff, useless wires, and trains wheezed their last before stalling mid-journey. Express to nowhere, as one commuter put it, clutching his frozen sandwich. For the ordinary Edwardian, the concept of climate change wasn't yet a political argument. It was a daily insult. People measured their survival by the number of fingers still attached. It wasn't just cold outside, it was cold everywhere. Drafts found their way into homes, through keyholes, under doors, even through letters if you stared long enough. Frost appeared on mirrors, not just from the outside but the inside, as though the glass itself had given up pretending to be solid. Carpets grew brittle, curtains stiffened, and walls perspired with condensation that immediately froze into delicate crystal filigrees. Even the royal family wasn't spared. In Windsor, courtiers recorded that Queen Alexandra refused to hold audiences near the palace windows for fear of catching a royal chill. Servants ran coal fires constantly, yet the frost crept in anyway, freezing water jugs on nightstands and turning bedchambers into scenic ice caves. Somewhere between the shivering footmen and the steaming teacups, the monarchy learned a crucial truth. Not even divine right could defrost your bathwater. Witnesses claimed you could see the royal family's breath during evening prayers, their devotion misting the air like faintly embarrassed smoke signals. Meanwhile, out in the countryside, farmers and fishermen turned amateur meteorologists. They read the sky like a bad novel, grey, repetitive, and full of foreboding. The wind direction became gossip. North meant despair, west meant a brief reprieve, and east meant you might as well knit yourself a coffin. The cold warped the landscape. Lakes turned solid enough for entire fairs to be held on their surface, complete with skating contests and impromptu snowball wars. Yet beneath the laughter was the gnawing fear that spring might have decided to retire. Even animals acted strangely. Birds migrated early, or simply didn't return. Cows gathered in tight huddles, emitting fog like budget steam engines. Cats, normally aloof, climbed into beds uninvited and were too cold to be evicted. Nature had stopped pretending to cooperate with humanity. Trees split from the pressure of frozen sap. Ponds burst their boundaries. Britain wasn't merely experiencing weather, it was surviving an act of passive-aggressive vengeance from the North Pole. But perhaps the most Edwardian response of all came from the scientists. In smoky laboratories, men with magnificent moustaches wrote serious reports explaining the phenomenon. Some blamed solar cycles, others the oscillations of the Atlantic currents, and at least one publication implied that the French might somehow be responsible. The Meteorological Office issued updates in language so dignified that you almost didn't notice they were essentially saying, well, we have no idea what's going on. And through all this, life went on. Postmen trudged through knee-high snow, icicles dangling from their moustaches like victory medals. Bakers baked with frozen yeast. Carters broke axles on ice. The sound of Britain that winter was the crunch of boots, the crack of splitting wood, and the distant cry of someone discovering that their pipes had exploded. Again. The newspapers began publishing survival tips. Wear multiple layers, thank you Captain Obvious. Eat hot porridge, assuming your milk isn't solid. Keep calm and light a fire, assuming you can afford coal. Meanwhile, local authorities issued cheerful bulletins reminding citizens to check on their neighbours, which in practice meant shouting, "Are you dead yet?" through the door. Still, amid all the suffering, something almost noble emerged. The cold forced people together, literally. Families clustered in one room around the fireplace. Neighbours shared coal, blankets, and gossip. Even strangers offered sympathetic nods, as if to say, "We're all freezing, but at least we're doing it with dignity." It was a moment when the British national character, stoic, dryly humorous, and a bit absurd, was tested and remarkably passed. By February, it became clear this was no passing chill, but a full emotional breakdown of the planet. The sun appeared occasionally, pale and apologetic, as if embarrassed by what it had done. Temperatures rose just enough to melt the top layer of snow before freezing it again overnight. A cruel cosmic prank. The Empire endured, wrapped in scarves, sarcasm and stubbornness. The winter of 1908 wasn't just weather. It was personality. A season with attitude. One that forced even the proudest citizens to realise that progress, manners and empire were no match for an angry sky. Britain didn't conquer the cold that year. It negotiated terms with it. And the terms were simple. Endure, complain beautifully, and hope next year's forecast included at least one day of mercy. In Edwardian Britain, the true measure of wealth wasn't how much silver you owned, how fine your waistcoat was, or how long your title sounded when announced at dinner. It was how many lumps of coal you could stack without crying. Coal wasn't just fuel, it was survival itself. The black diamond of the industrial age, the beating smoky heart of empire. And during the endless winter of 1908, it became more valuable than politeness at a London dinner party. Coal was the Bitcoin of 1908, except it actually kept you alive. In a nation powered by steam, soot, and sheer determination, coal-heated homes ran trains, cooked meals, and filled the lungs of everyone who had the misfortune of living within sniffing distance of progress. Without it, factories froze, families shivered, and civilization briefly remembered what darkness truly felt like. The great irony was that Britain, sitting atop vast coal reserves, still found itself freezing, because supply chains froze right along with everything else. Coal merchants, those soot-streaked brokers of human comfort, suddenly found themselves in high demand. Their horse-drawn carts became moving banks loaded with blocks of warmth that could decide whether a household spent the night shivering or smug. Demand soared, and so did prices. A ton of coal that cost $1 in November might cost double or triple by February. Families began treating coal cellars like vaults, guarding them jealously. In some neighbourhoods, the sight of a coal cart rumbling down the street caused small stampedes of people waving empty scuttles and desperate smiles. The working class felt the squeeze first. For the poor, buying coal in bulk was a fantasy. Most could only afford a small bag at a time, carried home like treasure. Housewives became experts in coal conservation, coaxing every ember to last just one more kettle's boil. They mixed cinders with damp newspaper, added kindling, whispered prayers to the chimney gods, and hoped for flame. If fire refused to cooperate, well, the family gathered anyway. For warmth, yes, but also to swear in unison. Meanwhile, the middle class entered full panic mode. Households with multiple fireplaces suddenly realised that heating every room was a dream, best left to novels. Families began closing off wings of their homes like they were sealing bulkheads on a sinking ship. Drawing rooms and studies were abandoned. Bedrooms became icy morgues. Everyone huddled around the one fire that could be kept alive, layering themselves like lasagna. Even the cat had to earn its spot near the hearth, preferably by purring loudly enough to justify the space. Newspapers printed advice columns on efficient coal usage, which mostly consisted of use less coal. The government offered encouragement instead of assistance because encouragement was cheaper. Wealthier citizens stockpiled coal early, stacking it in backyards and outbuildings, sometimes hidden beneath tarps to deter theft. Coal thieves became the new urban menace. There were reports of entire piles vanishing over a night, spirited away by shadowy figures armed with sacks, shovels, and moral flexibility. And yes, there were scams. Oh, the scams. The more desperate the cold, the more creative the con. Enterprising tricksters sold miracle briquettes that burned hotter and longer than ordinary coal, except they didn't. Some were made of sawdust and glue, others out of compressed dirt. The only thing they produced reliably was disappointment. One London shop even marketed eco-coal made from sustainable materials, which turned out to be shredded newspaper and crushed hopes. Buyers lit them once, coughed through the ensuing smog, and went back to regular carbon-based despair. In industrial towns like Manchester, Birmingham and Sheffield, factories faced their own crises. Coal shortages threatened to shut down steel mills and textile plants. Owners reluctantly reduced hours, workers reluctantly accepted hypothermia, and entire cities began to resemble large, smoky snow globes. Train companies announced delays due to fuel scarcity, which was British understatement for "we've run out of steam," literally. The empire's great engines, once symbols of unstoppable progress, sputtered to a standstill for lack of heat. Even the coal miners, the men who lived knee-deep in black dust, found themselves trapped in irony. Many couldn't work because frozen shafts and snow-blocked railways made transport impossible. The mines had the goods, but no way to deliver them. Whole communities in the north huddled together, surrounded by the stuff that could save them but unable to burn it because it was all bound for contracts and quotas further south. It was like starving in a bakery because the bread was earmarked for someone richer, and still the rich complained. In the grand estates, servants were dispatched hourly to keep fires stoked in every sitting room. Coal cellars the size of small chapels were emptied faster than teacups at a scandal. The upper class could afford warmth but not always comfort, because even luxury fireplaces had limits. Drafts crept through marble halls, making lords and ladies bundle up in ways that threatened their dignity. A chill of dreadful persistence, one duchess noted in her diary, as though the cold itself were being rude. For everyone else, ingenuity became the currency of survival. People burned whatever they could find. Old furniture, unwanted books, spare shoes, even wallpaper. London's air thickened with the smell of desperation and varnish. In poorer districts, you could track inflation by the colour of the smoke, black for coal, brown for broken chairs. A good fire was a miracle, a symbol of defiance, a small rebellion against the tyranny of ice. By late February, the crisis peaked. Newspapers began referring to coal as black gold, which was ironic since no one could afford it. Some cities implemented informal rationing, assigning quotas to households based on need, or more accurately, on who could shout the loudest. Rumours spread that the government might step in to regulate prices, but nothing melted faster than political resolve in the face of industrial profit. And yet, amid the soot and shortages, something deeply human persisted. Families gathered by their meagre fires and made jokes about frostbite. Neighbours shared leftover cinders. Children built coal sculptures when snow ran out. The very thing that powered the empire became a reminder of shared struggle, a substance that turned strangers into allies, if only because everyone smelled faintly of smoke. Coal didn't just keep people alive in 1908, it defined their humanity. It was warmth, status, and endurance wrapped in one grimy package. And as the endless winter dragged on, the Edwardians learned a universal truth. Love might warm the heart, but coal warmed everything else. Before electricity turned homes into glowing beehives of convenience, there was only one reliable signal everyone in Edwardian Britain connected to: the hearth. It didn't stream movies or download telegrams, but it did transmit the only thing that mattered during the endless winter of 1908: heat. You didn't gather around the fire for warmth. You did it because hypothermia loves company. The fireplace was the social, emotional, and occasionally dangerous nucleus of Edwardian domestic life. It crackled, hissed, and smoked its way through the season, doing its best impression of civilization's beating heart while quietly plotting to cover the entire room in soot. Every house, from the manor to the meanest terrace, revolved around it. Parlours, kitchens, even bedrooms were designed with one key idea: how close could you get to the fire before someone else did? And make no mistake, this was a full-contact sport. Families developed a complex social hierarchy based entirely on proximity to the flames. Grandfather, of course, claimed the prime seat. He'd earned it, allegedly through a lifetime of bad posture and better excuses. Mother kept close to stir the coals. Father monopolised the poker like it was a weapon of office, and children hovered at the periphery, hoping someone might drop dead or move. Even pets joined the battle. Cats spread themselves across the hearthrug like smug, furry monopolists. Dogs edged closer until their tails smoked, and the occasional parrot learned new vocabulary after being relocated too near the fender. Fire management was both science and superstition. A good fire was a symbol of respectability, steady, bright, and slightly threatening. Too much smoke meant poor maintenance. Too little flame suggested poverty or moral decline. Housewives took pride in their fires the way modern homeowners brag about kitchen islands. The art of laying one properly was practically a test of virtue. Newspaper first, preferably unread, though desperate times called for yesterday's scandal. Kindling second, and the coal pyramid on top. Then came the prayer, because no matter how carefully arranged, there was always a chance it would refuse to light out of sheer spite. But once lit, the hearth were magic. It transformed a cold grey house into something resembling life. Shadows danced across the wallpaper, turning cheap prints into moving pictures long before cinemas took over. The warmth spread unevenly, of course. Your front roasted while your back froze. But that too was part of the charm. The Edwardians learned to pivot in place like rotisserie chickens, slowly cooking themselves to comfort. Still, fires were unpredictable companions. They smoked, coughed, and occasionally tried to kill you. A clogged chimney could turn a cosy evening into a gas-filled nightmare. Sparks leapt free like rebellious fire fairies, landing on skirts, newspapers, or the occasional lapdog. And since safety regulations were more a suggestion than a rule, every Edwardian home contained a small but exciting chance of spontaneous combustion. Newspapers printed cheerful holiday warnings such as "Mind your curtains," while insurance companies quietly rubbed their hands together. Maintaining a fireplace was also hard labour disguised as domestic bliss. Ash had to be scooped out daily, coal scuttles refilled, grates polished, and the entire room dusted, because soot travelled with the enthusiasm of gossip. Curtains turned grey within weeks, ceilings darkened. If you hung laundry too close, you risked transforming your shirts into ashy relics. Yet despite the mess, people adored their hearths. The dirtier the mantelpiece, the more proudly they dusted it, proof that the fire still lived, and so did they. For the poor, the fireplace often doubled as stove, heater, and entertainment system all in one. Meals simmered over flickering flames while families swapped stories and toes thawed in slow rotation. A single lump of coal might see you through dinner and bedtime if you rationed it right. Children huddled under blankets by the embers, listening to tales that seemed to glow brighter than the coals themselves. Firelight made even poverty look poetic, for about 3 minutes, until the smoke stung your eyes again. In the wealthier homes, the relationship between family and fire was more ceremonial. Drawing rooms displayed marble hearths with intricate ironwork, meant as much for show as for function. Guests gathered around them with teacups and polite laughter, pretending not to notice when their hair caught stray cinders. The fire was stage lighting for social performance, warm enough to flatter, dim enough to conceal wrinkles and awkward silences. And then there were the seasonal rituals. Every morning began with the same routine, shaking the ashes from yesterday's blaze, rekindling the embers, and muttering quiet prayers to St. Combustion. Servants performed this sacred duty long before the household woke, often in freezing darkness. A good maid could coax a new fire from last night's remains with the precision of a chemist. A bad one would fill the house with smoke and tears. The line between success and tragedy was measured in matches. Yet the hearth was more than just utility. It was community. Neighbours dropped in for a warm, which usually meant sitting uninvited until someone hinted at bedtime. Courtships began beside the fire, where flickering light did flattering things to complexions. Elderly relatives dispensed wisdom from the fireside armchair as if the heat granted them moral authority. Even arguments softened here. It was hard to stay furious while your toes defrosted. But for all its charm, the fireplace was also a reminder of dependence. You couldn't ignore it, not for a day. It demanded feeding, cleaning, respect. Neglect it, and you'd be punished with smoke and chills. Love it, and it might grace you with a few golden hours of comfort. The hearth was both servant and tyrant, quietly ruling Edwardian domestic life with a sooty hand. By the time the endless winter stretched into its cruel middle months, every hearth in Britain worked overtime. You could walk down any street at dusk and see plumes of grey rising from chimneys, each one a desperate semaphore of survival. Behind every puff of smoke was a family gathered close, sharing warmth, stories, and the faint smell of burning optimism. The Edwardians didn't need wireless connections to feel united. Their fires connected them all, glowing beacons in the storm, fragile proofs that even in the coldest, darkest winter, humanity still flickered on. If you ever wondered what it's like to dress for survival while pretending it's for style, welcome to Edwardian winter fashion, a heroic combination of wool, flannel, and stubborn pride. The year was 1908, and the nation was being slowly encased in frost. But heaven forbid anyone looked uncomfortable. This was a society that would rather lose circulation than lose composure. The weather might have been cruel, but appearances were non-negotiable. Edwardian layering made onions jealous. The average person wore so many garments that undressing wasn't an act of convenience, it was a strategic campaign. The first layer was the foundation, thick woolen combinations that clung to the body like itchy promises. These combinations were essentially thermal prisons, part long johns, part self-loathing, and came in delightful shades of beige, oatmeal, or despair. They trapped warmth, sure, but also every ounce of moisture and regret. Next came the flannel. Flannel was the Edwardian miracle fabric, used for everything from shirts to petticoats to undergarments. Doctors even prescribed it. Wear flannel and live longer, they said, as if you could simply out-insulate mortality. Men wore flannel vests under their waistcoats. Women layered flannel petticoats under their skirts. Children, meanwhile, were swaddled in it until they resembled overcooked dumplings. It was less clothing and more a wearable sauna. Then came the corset, because why let your lungs expand when it's already hard to breathe in sub-zero temperatures? Edwardian corsets were masterpieces of engineering and masochism. Whalebone cages designed to sculpt the human form into an hourglass even when that form was trembling. Women braved frostbite and fainting with elegance, laced tightly enough to stay upright through sheer structural integrity. In theory, corsets provided warmth. In reality, they just ensured that shivering was done gracefully. Men, of course, had their own ritual suffering. Layers of wool shirts, waistcoats, and thick tweed jackets created the perfect blend of warmth and restricted movement. Add to that heavy overcoats and scarves, and suddenly every trip to the market became a cardiovascular challenge. The Edwardian man might have been dignified, but he also sweated like a tea kettle under all that tweed. The irony: by the time he reached his destination, he'd remove his hat to reveal the damp hair of someone who'd clearly lost the war with his own body heat. For women, outerwear was both armour and advertisement. Long coats trimmed with fur, fox, sable, ermine if you were rich enough, became the season's must-have survival statement. It wasn't just about warmth, it was about class. The bigger the fur collar, the higher your social standing, and the stronger the smell if you got caught in the rain. Hats, too, reached architectural extremes. Feathers, ribbons, and sometimes entire taxidermied birds perched atop heads that already struggled under the weight of societal expectation. But elegance came at a cost, and that cost was mobility. Edwardian skirts were long and heavy, especially when wet. Imagine walking through snow in a Victorian tablecloth, and you'll get the idea. Many women resorted to lifting their hems discreetly with one gloved hand, a manoeuvre that often resulted in frostbitten ankles and scandalised onlookers. Men, meanwhile, weren't much better off. Their stiff collars and button coats gave them the air of frozen penguins attempting dignity. Accessories were their own battlefield. Gloves were essential, not just for warmth, but for moral decency. Bare hands in public were practically an invitation to judgment. Leather gloves froze stiff within minutes. So many preferred wool, which absorbed both water and sadness equally well. Scarves were wrapped so tightly that conversation became optional. And let's not forget the boots, heavy, hobnailed monsters designed to keep out snow and circulation alike. Removing them at day's end was an act of courage usually accompanied by the faint scent of cooked wool. For children, winter fashion was simply a form of controlled suffering. Layered until they could barely move, Edwardian youngsters toddled through the snow like miniature wardrobes. Mothers believed fresh air built character. So out they went, trussed up in wool capes and mittens so thick they couldn't even pick up a snowball. It wasn't childhood. It was slow-motion taxidermy. And yet, for all the discomfort, the Edwardians maintained their sartorial composure. Society was obsessed with propriety. Warmth was secondary to dignity. You didn't dress for the weather, you dressed for the judgment. Walking down the street shivering was fine, as long as your hat was straight. A blue nose was practically a badge of respectability. People looked half frozen, but fashion magazines reassured them that pallor is chic, and brisk cheeks suggest moral vitality. Translation: hypothermia, but make it fashionable. Even indoor fashion bowed to the cold. Drawing rooms were rarely warm enough to justify removing layers, so guests simply loosened a button and pretended to be comfortable. Women draped shawls over evening gowns, men kept their gloves on through entire dinners. Social visits became a polite endurance contest. Whoever kept smiling longest without their teeth chattering won. By late winter, though, practicality began to sneak in under the skirts of pride. Knitted cardigans became popular, a shocking admission that comfort might be acceptable after all. Knitting societies boomed, and advertisements for thermal innovations like fleece-lined boots or woolen union suits filled the papers. Even the upper class began to experiment with less formal wear at home, scandalising fashion columnists who saw coziness as a slippery slope toward moral decay. Still, no matter how deep the frieze or how ridiculous the outfit, Edwardians faced it with flair. They believed clothing wasn't just proportion, it was personality. Their layers were declarations of endurance, their corsets badges of control, their furs symbols of survival disguised as elegance. Beneath every lace collar and tweed sleeve was the quiet defiance of a people who refused to let the weather dictate their dignity. Because in Edwardian Britain, style wasn't about comfort, it was about composure, even if your toes were plotting their escape. If necessity is the mother of invention, then cold weather is its slightly deranged aunt, the one who starts stuffing anything vaguely warm into the bed. By 1908, as Britain shivered through yet another week of the endless winter, the nation's relationship with warmth had evolved from luxury to emergency. Central heating was still the fantasy of rich Americans and eccentric inventors, so Edwardians turned to their trusty household allies: hot water bottles, bed warmers, and, when all else failed, anything that emitted even a whisper of heat. If it was warm and vaguely alive, it was probably used as a heating device. The Edwardian hot water bottle was less cute comfort and more boiling hazard. Made from thick stoneware or copper, these bottles were filled with scalding water and sealed with a cork, then slipped under blankets to warm the bed. In theory, this was a gentle invitation to sleep. In practice, it was a nightly gamble between frostbite and third-degree burns. Families developed rituals around them, filling, carrying, and carefully tucking the bottles like sacred relics. Children would leap into bed with reverence and the cautious optimism of someone unsure whether they'd wake up cozy or blistered. Stoneware bottles were the classic choice, heavy, durable, and roughly the temperature of molten lava when fresh from the kettle. Their rounded bellies stayed hot for hours, radiating blissful warmth under thick blankets. But they also weighed as much as a small cannonball, and any midnight shift could turn them into blunt instruments of pain. Countless Edwardians learned the hard way that rolling onto a stone bottle was the closest thing to spontaneous enlightenment. For those of more refined or desperate taste, metal bed warmers offered a touch of ceremony. These devices looked like flattened brass kettles with long handles, filled with glowing coals from the hearth. A servant would glide them between the sheets, moving in slow, careful circles to distribute the heat without igniting the mattress. It was an art form, 1 part technique, 2 parts prayer. The sound of sizzling linen was the Edwardian equivalent of a smoke alarm. Many servants perfected the motion, a few did not. The result was the occasional spectacular headline about bed warmer disaster in Mayfair, or house reduced to ashes by overzealous comfort. Some households experimented with rubber hot water bottles, a newfangled invention imported from America. They were lighter, flexible, and far less likely to double as blunt trauma. But the early rubber smelled vaguely like industrial despair, and leaks were alarmingly common. Waking up to a wet bed in 1908 didn't mean embarrassment. It meant plumbing failure. Many Edwardians stuck with what they knew: thick ceramics, hot coals, and blind optimism. Not all solutions came from the shop. The more inventive or broke families turned to improvised methods. Hot bricks wrapped in flannel were popular. They could be heated in the oven, carried upstairs, and tucked into the bed's foot like a loyal foot soldier. Baked potatoes were another makeshift warmer, cheap, effective, and conveniently edible. If the potato cooled, you simply ate your heater. 2 problems solved at once: There were even stories of families warming socks on the mantel, then wearing them immediately to trap the fleeting warmth like smug little heat thieves. But sometimes, practicality gave way to sheer absurdity. Cats, for instance, became unofficial heating units. Small, furry, and conveniently self-warming, they were coaxed or coerced under blankets as living hot water bottles. Many Edwardian cats didn't so much nap on beds as perform unpaid domestic service. Dogs were drafted too, especially lap dogs, who were strategically positioned at the feet like loyal sentinels against frostbite. If your pet protested, you just called it training. Other household heroes included the humble kettle, always boiling, always ready. Before bed, families filled their bottles from it or hovered over the steam like worshippers before an altar. In less fortunate homes, kettles served as makeshift humidifiers, and occasionally as very personal hand warmers when held tightly enough. Even teapot moonlighted as heat dispensers. Some were wrapped in cloth and used as portable radiators. Of course, all this effort came with a fair share of accidents. Corks popped unexpectedly, sending fountains of boiling water across sheets. Overfilled bottles cracked from thermal shock, leaving scalded knees and a story for the neighbours. Servants scorched bedding with bed warmers and swore eternal vengeance against physics. There was even an infamous case in Yorkshire where a woman's innovative use of a foot stove ended with the local fire brigade and a smoking pair of boots. Still, the nightly dance of warming objects had its own rhythm. The household would prepare for bed like a military operation. Kettles whistling, servants ferrying coals, everyone waiting for their turn to receive their precious warmth token. Once in bed, tucked beneath layers of blankets heavy enough to flatten a medium-sized cow, they'd nestle their bottles close. The hiss of cooling water, the faint crackle of embers, it was as close as Edwardians got to bedtime bliss. There was also a strange intimacy to it all. In an era when emotions were as tightly laced as corsets, the ritual of warmth brought families together. Couples shared bottles under the sheets, hands brushing accidentally in the dark. Children clung to their warm bricks like security blankets. Even the servants, after finishing their rounds, kept one small bottle for themselves, a humble luxury earned through frozen fingers and near-death experiences with the tongs. The Edwardians were a people defined by resilience and ingenuity. They could turn a piece of pottery, a glowing ember, or a furry animal into an instrument of survival. Every hiss, every puff of steam, every purring cat represented small victories against the season that refused to end. And while modern comforts have replaced these clumsy contraptions, there's something poetic about the old methods. They were tactile, temperamental, and undeniably human. They required attention, patience, and the occasional bandage. But they worked, most of the time. Because in 808, warmth wasn't guaranteed. It was crafted, coaxed, and fought for. And whether it came from a stone bottle, a loyal cat, or a dangerously hot brick, the goal was always the same: to remind yourself as you drifted off to sleep that for one glorious moment you had won the battle against the cold. For most Edwardian families, there was only one room in the entire house that didn't feel like a frozen tomb: the kitchen. While bedrooms iced over, parlours turned into breath-testing chambers, and hallways felt like drafts with wallpaper. The kitchen roared with heat, noise, and the smell of survival. It was the beating heart of the household, a place where warmth was earned, not assumed. Dinner wasn't about flavour, it was about which part of the body defrosted first. At the centre of this small domestic universe sat the coal stove, hulking, temperamental, and omnipotent. A good stove could feed a family, heat the house, and dry the washing, provided you kept it satisfied with a steady diet of coal and curses. These iron beasts were half appliance, half deity. They demanded attention, reverence, and the occasional bribe of extra fuel. Each one came equipped with multiple compartments, oven, boiler, and a mysterious drawer no one quite understood but feared to ignore. Managing it was less like cooking and more like negotiating with a dragon. Every morning the ritual began before dawn. The household's cook or maid, if the family was fortunate enough to have one, would stumble down to the kitchen, still half asleep, to coax the dying embers of the previous night's fire back to life. Bellows wheezed, kindling crackled, and the room slowly transitioned from tomb to furnace. Only then could the rest of the house begin to stir, relying on the kitchen's heat to creep up through the floorboards like benevolent smoke signals. For servants, this daily ignition was both an act of service and self-preservation. The quicker the stove came alive, the sooner their fingers stopped feeling like ice sculptures. Cooking on a coal stove was an art of patience and precision, or perhaps masochism. Temperature control was achieved not by knobs, but by instinct and prayer. Recipes might as well have said, "Bake until it looks done and your hope fades." You adjusted the heat by opening vents, shifting coals, or occasionally yelling at the fire. Pies were baked. Soup simmered and roast roasted, all under the watchful gaze of a cook who knew that one wrong move could turn dinner into charcoal. The phrase burnt offering wasn't just biblical, it was Tuesday. Yet despite the chaos, the kitchen was a place of strange camaraderie. For the lower classes, it was often the only room where the family truly gathered. Parents cooked, children more hovered, and everyone basked in the stove's generous warmth like pilgrims before a holy relic. For the wealthy, it was the servants' domain, far removed from the genteel frost of the dining room upstairs. The master might complain of a draught during dinner, while below, the staff glistened like human kettles in 40-degree heat. The Edwardian household was a world divided by temperature. Upstairs froze in lace and manners. Downstairs sweated in aprons and survival. The kitchen hierarchy was as rigid as the social one. At the top stood the cook, ruler of the range, guardian of the coal supply, and feared mistress of the ladle. Beneath her were the scullery maids, condemned to scrub endless towers of soot-blackened pots, their hands permanently pruned from cold water. Then came the kitchen maids, the errand runners, the kettle fillers, and the toast watchers, all performing the synchronized ballet that kept Edwardian domestic life running and simmering. Each knew their place, and none dared question the cook's authority, for she could ruin reputations with a single oversalted remark. But for all its discipline, the kitchen was also a refuge. Servants, especially in large houses, treated it as their hearth, the one place where they could laugh, gossip, or sneak bites of leftover pudding without the weight of upper-class eyes. The fire roaring in its iron cage cast shadows that softened the edges of exhaustion. Even in poor homes, where the kitchen was barely more than a table and a fire grate, the warmth offered a kind of democracy. Around the stove everyone was equal, equally warm, equally hungry, equally relieved not to be anywhere else. It wasn't all comfort, of course. The heat that made the kitchen livable also made it unbearable. In winter it was paradise, in summer it was purgatory. Cooks joked that they didn't need to visit hell because they already worked in it. Add to that the constant clouds of smoke, the hiss of boiling kettles, and the occasional explosion when grease met flame, and you had the soundscape of Edwardian cuisine, sizzling coughing and mild screaming. But compared to the rest of the icebox masquerading as a house, this was bliss. Kitchens also carried their own unique hazards. Long skirts and open flames were a perilous combination, as were loose sleeves, dangling cloths, and the occasional mouse attempting suicide by stove. Burns were badges of honour, soot stains a kind of uniform. Fireguards were rare luxuries, quick reflexes were not. It was common to hear sudden yelps followed by muttered swearing and the smell of singed apron. Yet the work continued because the stove never slept, and neither did hunger. For all the chaos, though, the kitchen had its rhythms. Breakfast boiled, dinner roasted, supper stewed. The clatter of pots, the scrape of coal shovels, the rhythmic ticking of the mantel clock all merged into the daily heartbeat of Edwardian domesticity. And always, there was warmth. Not just physical, but emotional, the kind that flickers in shared effort, in laughter over failed puddings, in the quiet pride of serving something hot to those who needed it most. By evening, when the fire burned low and the house above settled into cold sleep, the kitchen lingered in gentle glow. The last dishes were stacked, the last pot wiped clean, and the final embers stirred one last time before bed. In that dim light, the stove sat like a sleeping beast, soot-streaked, loyal, and waiting for dawn. Tomorrow it would roar again, spreading warmth through the floors, into the bones of every Edwardian too stubborn to surrender to winter. Because in 1908, the kitchen wasn't just a place for meals, it was the household's volcano, unpredictable, life-giving, and always just a little bit dangerous. If there was one ritual in Edwardian life that required courage, strategy, and a touch of masochism, it was bathing. You didn't bathe to feel clean, you bathed to test your will to live. Forget candle-lit soaks and lavender bubbles. Edwardian bathing was less spa experience and more accidental polar expedition. Every bath began with optimism and ended with existential reflection. Indoor plumbing was still a luxury in 1908. Most homes, even respectable ones, relied on portable tubs and patience. The iconic copper bath, deep, gleaming, and faintly menacing, Random said, was the centerpiece of the ordeal. It looked beautiful in catalogues, but in reality, it was a freezing metal basin that amplified every shriek, splash, and regret like a brass instrument of suffering. Filling it was an all-day event. First, someone, usually a servant or the most unfortunate family member, had to haul bucket after bucket of water from the kitchen, where the stove worked double shifts boiling it. This took time, roughly the length of a small opera. Then, once the tub was finally full, the real race began. How long could you bathe before the laws of thermodynamics betrayed you? Because Edwardian bathwater cooled faster than optimism in February. By the time you climbed in, half of it was already lukewarm. By the time you reached your elbows, it had entered the realm of emotional cold. Temperature management was an art form. You learned to rotate constantly, turning like a roast to keep each limb evenly unfrozen. The first 30 seconds were bliss. That brief, delusional moment when the water was warm and hope was alive. Then the chill crept in, stealthy and merciless. Every ripple brought a wave of despair. Soap refused to lather properly, because Edwardian water often carried more minerals than a quarry. And the scent of carbolic soap, that harsh medicinal perfume, lingered like regret long after you'd escaped the tub. For the wealthy, bathing was slightly less traumatic, though still inconvenient enough to remind them they were human. Grand houses had bathrooms with plumbed-in fixtures, some even boasting hot taps when the boiler cooperated. But water pressure was fickle, and pipes were prone to freezing solid. A duchess might prepare a luxurious bath only to find herself seated in 2 inches of tepid sludge, contemplating her life choices while servants frantically hammered ice from the plumbing. Servants, of course, bore the brunt of the bathing system. Before the masters could enjoy their scalding soak, maids filled and carried countless heavy pails up flights of stairs, balancing them with the grace of acrobats and the despair of pack animals. Then they'd haul the used, grimy water back down again, a Sisyphean task that left them both exhausted and, ironically, in desperate need of a bath themselves. But baths were rare treats for servants. Most made do with a quick scrub at the kitchen sink, surrounded by potatoes, kettles, and the vague smell of last night's stew. For working-class families, the copper tub wasn't a private sanctuary, and it was a group project. The weekly bath night was a social event of sorts, conducted with grim practicality. The father went first, followed by the mother, then the children in descending order of importance. By the final round, the water looked like weak soup and smelled like moral victory. Hygiene wasn't about luxury, it was about endurance. Everyone went to bed pink, pruny, and quietly traumatized. Of course there were public baths, for those who lacked even a portable tub. Edwardian cities boasted bathhouses where, for a small fee, you could rent a cubicle, fill a basin, and pray for warmth. These establishments varied wildly in quality. Some were well-run civic institutions, tiled and efficient. Others resembled scenes from Dante's Inferno, with peeling paint, steaming pipes, and attendants who clearly hated everyone. Patrons queued with towels under their arms, clutching soap and small coins, dreaming of 10 minutes of heat before returning to their frost-bitten lodgings. And yet, despite the discomfort, bathing carried a strange sense of pride. Cleanliness had become a moral virtue by the early 20th century. Not bathing was practically a sin against progress. Advertisements promised health through hygiene, depicting smiling families who looked suspiciously dry. Doctors preached the benefits of regular washing, conveniently overlooking the fact that most of their patients didn't have indoor taps. The empire itself took cleanliness as a metaphor for superiority, though the average Londoner's bathroom suggested otherwise. Then there were the gadgets, those wonderful, ridiculous contraptions that promised to make bathing modern. Gas-fired water heaters, for example, were touted as miraculous, until they exploded with alarming frequency. Portable foot warmers shaped like miniature bathtubs circulated in catalogues, claiming to keep you cosy while washing, but mostly scolded anyone bold enough to try them. And somewhere an optimistic inventor was always designing a mechanical tub that could fill, drain and scrub automatically. It rarely worked, but the dream was as warm as the water wasn't. The aftermath of an Edwardian bath was a production in itself. Towels, if you were lucky, were warmed by the fire, otherwise they were stiff with cold, capable of exfoliating both skin and dignity. Hair washing was an ordeal reserved for special occasions involving basins, vinegar rinses, and at least one bout of tears. And since the air temperature hovered somewhere between glacial and Y, most people emerged from the bath only to wrap themselves in layers of flannel faster than you could say pneumonia. Still, there was something oddly satisfying about surviving an Edwardian bath. It wasn't just about hygiene, it was about proving that you could conquer discomfort with grace. To lower yourself into that tub was to declare victory over circumstance, at least temporarily. When the steam rose and the house filled with that faint metallic scent, there was a moment, brief but real, when life didn't seem so cruel. And as you stood afterward, trembling in your dressing gown, watching the bath water cool and turn grey, you couldn't help but feel a certain pride. You'd done it. You'd bathed. You'd stared into the face of winter and said, "Not today." It didn't make you clean exactly, but it did make you resilient, and in 1908 that was close enough. Sleep in Edwardian winter was less about rest and more about survival. The day might have been long, the coal might have burned low, but night brought its own special brand of misery, the kind that settled into your bones and made you question whether being alive was worth it. Bedrooms were meant for repose, but during the endless winter of 1908, they felt more like refrigerated waiting rooms between one day of freezing and the next. Romance was difficult when your partner's nose froze to yours. The first challenge was entering the bedroom itself. Most houses were designed with the fireplace as a privilege of the downstairs rooms, which meant the upper floors existed mainly as frozen exhibitions of wallpaper. By the time you climbed into bed, you could see your breath curling in the air like a ghost too cold to haunt properly. The walls perspired frost. The windows developed beautiful, treacherous patterns of ice on the inside, transforming every pane into an accidental art gallery. And if you were unlucky enough to touch the glass, it responded with the same enthusiasm as a dead fish. The bed was supposed to be your refuge, a mountain of blankets, feather pillows, and false hope. Feather beds were prized for their ability to trap warmth, though warmth was a relative term. The trick was to pile on so many layers that you couldn't move, then hope for the best. Wool blankets, counterpanes, coverlets, and quilts were stacked until they achieved geological depth. It was said that once properly tucked in, you had to choose between breathing and circulation. The good news was that you were less likely to fall out of bed. The bad news was that if the house caught fire, you'd die of smothering before the flames reached you. To prepare for bed, every Edwardian household had its own bedtime rituals. Servants, or in poorer homes, mothers and eldest daughters, would air the sheets by waving them near the fire for a few blessed seconds before rushing them back upstairs like holy relics. In grander homes, maids warmed the bed with heated pans filled with glowing embers, a process that often left a faint scorch mark and an exciting sense of danger. More practical families relied on bricks or flat irons heated in the kitchen stove, wrapped in cloth, and slipped between the sheets at the foot of the bed. These foot warmers offered blissful relief for about 10 minutes, then cooled into heavy lumps of disappointment. Even so, bedtime was a moment of collective gratitude. For a brief, glorious instant as you slid under the covers, you could almost imagine the cold was kept at bay. But then came the nightly negotiations. Couples fought silent wars over territory. Every inch of blanket was contested. Every stolen corner of quilt a small act of betrayal. Children slept 3 or 4 to a bed, forming a human furnace fueled by shared body heat and muffled complaints. Pets, if allowed, joined the melee. Cats curling near feet, dogs storing beside legs, all of them contributing to the shared warmth and general chaos. Nightwear itself was an exercise in both fashion and fortitude. Edwardian pyjamas were thick, flannel fortresses that could double as camping gear. Men favoured long nightshirts that resembled ghost costumes, while women wore high-collared gowns with enough lace to trap a draft. Socks were essential, nightcaps were universal, and mittens were not unheard of. The goal wasn't comfort, it was preservation. You didn't want to wake up refreshed, you wanted to wake up at all. And then there was the problem of condensation. With so many bodies breathing into cold air, moisture gathered on the walls, the ceiling, even the furniture. By morning, bedposts sparkled with frost, and the chamber pot, kept prudently under the bed to avoid nocturnal adventures through the icy hallway, sometimes froze solid. Getting out of bed was an act of sheer heroism. The moment the covers lifted, the cold attacked like a mugger. Most people performed a frantic dressing ritual, hopping on one foot while pulling on socks and muttering prayers. In wealthier homes, there was at least the illusion of comfort. Bed curtains, heavy drapes that enclosed the sleeper, offered some insulation, though they also made the bed feel like a velvet coffin. Some families invested in fancier warming devices, ceramic pig bottles shaped like pudgy animals and filled with hot water, or ornate brass foot stove lined with embers. There were even mechanical contraptions promising constant nocturnal heat, which mostly produced constant nocturnal terror. But for every success story there were accidents, cracked bottles, burned sheets, and the occasional singed foot. Despite all these challenges, the Edwardians found ways to romanticize the cold. Lovers wrote letters describing crisp nights and brisk air, as though frostbite were foreplay. Poets praised the hush of winter, conveniently ignoring the part where they couldn't feel their fingers. And in families across Britain, morning came not with the sound of birdsong but with a chorus of sneezes. Still, there was something deeply human about it, this nightly surrender to the elements, wrapped in layers of wool and hope. Every generation likes to believe it suffers nobly, but the Edwardians earned their misery in instalments. They faced nights so cold that even the moon seemed to shiver, yet they persisted, reading by candlelight, whispering stories under blankets, and pretending the rattling windows were just charming ambience. It wasn't luxury, but it was life. And somehow, between the cold sheets and the crackling frost, they managed to find warmth where it mattered most, in laughter, in company, in the simple victory of waking up one more morning to do it all again. Because no matter how bleak the weather, no one ever froze completely alone. There was always another heartbeat nearby, another pair of frozen feet fighting for space under the covers, another sigh in the darkness saying in the unspoken Edwardian way, "We're still here." Nothing says team spirit like watching someone else freeze on your behalf. In Edwardian Britain, no one understood that better than the domestic servants, the unsung heroes and involuntary ice sculptures of the endless winter of 1908. While their employers complained about drafts from behind lace curtains, servants were out in the pre-dawn darkness, breaking ice, hauling coal, and trying not to freeze solid before breakfast. The Edwardian household ran on hierarchy and temperature. The higher your status, the warmer your surroundings. The master and mistress had their fires stoked and their bath water poured. The servants had their circulation tested by nature. The grander the home, the more complex the choreography of warmth became. Dozens of fireplaces needed tending, each one demanding fuel, ash removal, and vigilance. The entire domestic machine depended on those whose job was to make sure others didn't notice how cold life really was. Morning began in what can only be described as misery's opening act. Long before dawn, the maid-of-all-work or footman descended into the basement, shivering through layers of coarse wool to rouse the sleeping stove. The kitchen range, still slumbering from the night before, had to be coaxed back to life. Sparks, smoke, and muttered curses filled the air. Once the coals glowed red, the servants' day truly began. Buckets of ash were lugged out, coal scuttles refilled, and fires laid in every room scheduled for comfort. The house would awaken to a gentle warmth. The servants would already be on their third near-death experience of the morning. Fetching coal was its own ordeal. The coal shed, usually located somewhere outdoors and far from mercy, was often frozen shut. Servants broke through ice with numb fingers, shoveling the black dust into scuttles, while the wind howled like an unpaid butler. By the time they trudged back inside, faces raw from the cold, the upper floors were only just beginning to stir, and as the family rang their bells for morning tea, the servants were already sprinting up narrow staircases, balancing trays, teapots, and their own dwindling sanity. Lighting the upstairs fires required both skill and stealth. Servants crept into bedrooms at ungodly hours to lay kindling and coal, hoping to warm the room before their employers' delicate noses detected the chill. A good servant could ignite a blaze without waking the household. A bad one would be rewarded with a scolding for disturbing sleep, or worse, a deduction from wages for using too much coal. The irony, of course, was that those same employers would spend the rest of the day boasting to guests about how one simply must keep the fires going. Water, meanwhile, presented a separate set of horrors. Before a single face could be washed or bath-filled, servants had to break through ice in outdoor pumps or cisterns. The sound of hammering echoed through backyards as they cracked open nature's cruel joke, often with bare hands. Then came the hauling. Bucket after bucket of freezing water lugged up endless staircases, heated over the kitchen range, then carried back up again to fill bathtubs for those who found the idea of tepid water ghastly. By the time the mistress of the house lowered herself into her steaming bath, somewhere downstairs a maid was thawing her hands over a candle stub and wondering if frostbite counted as a holiday. And the cold didn't just test endurance, it tested discipline. A servant couldn't complain. They smiled through chattering teeth, bowed with frozen joints, and addressed the lady of the house as ma'am, even when their eyelashes were stuck together. In the Edwardian code of service, discomfort was invisible. Pain was part of the uniform, but in private, below stairs, there was solidarity. Around the kitchen fire, their one reliable refuge, servants shared jokes, gossip, and warmth. The downstairs hearth was democracy in action. The butler, the scullery maid, and the cook all drawing heat from the same flames, united by exhaustion and burnt toast. The cook ruled that domain like a monarch. Her range provided the household's meals and its warmth, and she guarded both fiercely. Woe betide any footman who came too close with cold fingers. For many servants, the kitchen was the only truly warm place they'd stand all day. They lingered there between errands, letting the heat soak through their uniforms before being summoned by the shrill ring of the master's bell, a sound as dreaded as a church gong announcing judgment. Evenings brought no reprieve. When the family retired to bed, the servants' work began again, clearing ashes, banking fires for the night, scrubbing soot from hearths. Then came the final round, carrying hot bricks upstairs for their employers' beds. The servants' own quarters, meanwhile, were unheated, small and occasionally mistaken for walk-in refrigerators. Beds were narrow, sheets perpetually damp, and ceilings low enough to knock your head on while trying to shiver in peace. Many slept in their work clothes for warmth. A few kept their boots on, just in case their water jugs froze over by morning. Despite everything, there was pride in the work. To keep a grand house running in such conditions required a kind of stoic genius. Servants developed an intuitive relationship with fire and frost. They could tell by smell when a chimney was sulking or predict from the groan of pipes which tap was about to freeze. Their resilience was unmatched, a quiet defiance beneath the layers of soot and subservience. Upstairs, the Edwardians congratulated themselves on their comfortable winter. They sipped tea beside glowing fireplaces and wrote letters about the charm of snowy mornings. Downstairs, the real labour of warmth continued unseen. For every cup of steaming cocoa, there were hours of shoveling, hauling and thawing, the invisible cost of comfort paid in frozen fingertips. The cold chain of command was absolute. Heat flowed upward, suffering stayed below. But even in that rigid structure, the servants found something unbreakable: community. They shared the jokes, the chores and the fire, and when the house above grew quiet, they sat together by the last embers, laughing softly in the glow. For all their exhaustion, they knew a truth their masters never would. Warmth feels warmer when you've earned it yourself, because in the Edwardian winter every fire told two stories, one of comfort and one of the cold hands that kept it burning. Childhood, as every Edwardian adult firmly believed, was an ideal time to develop discipline, endurance, and a casual relationship with hypothermia. The endless winter of 1908 may have left grown-ups miserable, but for children it was paradise, if your definition of paradise involves frozen fingers, soggy socks, and mild frostbite disguised as fun. Childhood builds character, mostly from scar tissue. The snow came early that year and refused to leave, blanketing gardens, fields, and streets in a sheet of temptation. Schools might close for a day or simply freeze solid, and suddenly Britain became a vast playground. Children didn't see the frost as danger, they saw it as opportunity. Snow meant escape from chores, lessons, and the terrifying ordeal of arithmetic. It meant snowballs, slides, and laughter that steamed in the frozen air. Parents looked out the window, sighed at the thought of laundry, and accepted that at least their offspring's energy was warming someone. Snowmen were the first order of business, those lumpy monuments to optimism and poor craftsmanship. Building one was a ritual. Every child began with excitement and ended with wet mittens, an uneven torso, and arguments over who got to use the carrot. The wealthy had gardens large enough for entire armies of snowmen, lined up like frosty footmen awaiting orders. The poor used whatever patch of slush the street offered, sometimes borrowing coal from the scuttle for eyes, only to be told off later by their parents, who'd planned to burn it. By evening, the proud creations leaned dangerously, slowly melting into what looked like snow ghosts surrendering to gravity. Then there were the snowball fights, the great winter wars of Edwardian childhood. These weren't the soft, playful tosses of modern times. They were strategic, organised, and occasionally violent. Streets became battlegrounds, with fortresses of packed snow rising on either side. Boys filled buckets, girls stockpiled ammunition, and neighbourhood alliances formed and broke faster than parliamentary coalitions. Every skirmish ended the same way: red noses, triumphant cheers, and one unlucky soul trudging home to explain a black eye caused by the weather. Parents pretended not to notice, secretly pleased that their children were learning both aim and endurance. Ice was the true gift of winter, though also its curse. Puddles froze overnight, and the world became one big invitation to slip. Children invented ice slides, smooth patches on frozen roads polished by that repeated gliding. The goal was simple: sprint, slide, and hope you stopped before colliding with a lamppost. The sound of laughter and occasional impact echoed through every neighbourhood. In cities, policemen despised these slides, calling them a public menace. They would scatter sand to stop the fun, only to find new slides forming an hour later. Rural children had ponds and rivers, which offered higher stakes. Skating on them was exhilarating until the first ominous crack. Many learned early that the boundary between joy and pneumonia was surprisingly thin. Poorer families, lacking proper sleds or skates, improvised with heroic creativity. Dustpan lids, wooden boards, and even baking trays were repurposed into makeshift sledges. Wealthier children might boast elegant toboggans, polished wood, brass runners, the works. But in the end, everyone screamed the same way when gravity took over. Hillsides became scenes of joyful chaos, children hurtling past, scarves streaming, parents shouting half-hearted warnings that were lost to the wind. Even indoors, winter play continued. When the weather was too cruel for outside adventures, Edwardian children brought their imagination indoors. Drawing room rug slides were popular until a priceless vase met its end. Others staged theatrical Arctic expeditions, wrapping themselves in blankets and pretending to discover new territories behind the sofa. In working-class homes, space was tight, but laughter filled the air as children built pillow forts and played snowstorm with handfuls of flour, an idea every mother regretted immediately. Of course, fun came with risk, an Edwardian tradition. Frostbite was an accepted part of growing up. Ears turned red, fingers went numb, and no one seemed particularly concerned. Mothers scolded, rubbed hands with goose fat, and sent their children right back outside. Health manuals of the time encouraged vigorous outdoor exercise, believing that cold air built resilience and moral fibre. It probably did, along with mild respiratory trauma. And yet, for all the danger, winter play brought out a rare kind of equality. The children of shopkeepers, factory workers, and clerks all played side by side, bound by the universal language of frozen chaos. Even in grand estates where governesses tried to maintain decorum, laughter still slipped past the rules. A baronet's son and a scullery maid's daughter might share the same snow hill, momentarily forgetting class in the rush of sliding downhill too fast. The cold didn't care about titles, and neither did the children. Evening brought the price of joy. Damp clothes hung over fires, boots steamed, and mittens sizzled on hearths like wool sausages. Parents patched torn coats and scolded through smiles. The sound of sniffles filled the air, a chorus of small victories against the elements. Beds awaited, piled with blankets, while outside the snow fell silently, erasing footprints and preparing a fresh canvas for the next day's adventures. Winter might have been cruel, but to Edwardian children it was magic, the kind of magic that burns your cheeks, numbs your toes and fills your heart. They would look back on those days, decades later, and remember not the cold but the thrill, the snowball fights, the slides, the laughter that steamed in the air. And maybe, just maybe, they'd remember the lesson that every Edwardian child learned by instinct, that play, like life, was best met with courage, imagination, and the occasional bruised knee, because when the world freezes solid, the only thing to do is slide on it. In Edwardian Britain, the pursuit of education often required bravery equal to that of polar explorers. School wasn't just a place of learning, it was a test of physical endurance disguised as moral improvement. The motto might as well have been read right and try not to freeze solid. Students didn't skip class. They just couldn't move. By 1908, the endless winter had transformed classrooms across Britain into frosty chambers of suffering. Heating, if it existed at all, was an afterthought. In rural schools, a single cast-iron stove stood like a reluctant guardian in the corner, meant to warm a room large enough to house 40 children, a teacher, and at least one disappointed portrait of the king. The stove was usually fueled by damp coal that smoked more than it burned, filling the air with the scent of carbon and despair. The lucky few who sat closest to it could almost feel their toes, while those in the back row learned to accept their new lives as decorative icicles. Teachers tried to rotate students near the stove for fairness, but fairness was a concept that melted quickly in cold weather. The older children usually claimed the warmest seats, invoking the ancient playground law of finders keepers, shiverers weepers. Meanwhile, the youngest pupils sat furthest from the fire, bundled in hand-me-down scarves and looking like exhausted snowmen. The cold had an impressive impact on academics. Ink froze mid-sentence, nibs splintered, and slates cracked from temperature shock. Writing became an extreme sport. Children learned to blow on their inkwells or hold them near candles, often resulting in scorched sleeves and minor burns. Essays began bravely but ended abruptly, not because of boredom, but because the ink had turned to sludge. Teachers graded papers not by penmanship, but by survival rate. essay incomplete due to frostbite was a perfectly acceptable excuse. The teachers themselves fared little better. Clad in wool shawls and optimism, they soldiered through lessons while secretly losing feeling in their extremities. Many brought their own small stoves, which provided just enough heat to remind them what warmth used to feel like. Some schools distributed warming bricks for the staff, chunks of heated clay wrapped in flannel, though most cooled faster than a student's enthusiasm for Latin. Every morning a teacher would arrive early to unlock the building, scrape frost off the inside of the windows, and mutter prayers that at least one student would bring a usable piece of coal from home. Indeed, bring a lump of coal for the school stove became a common instruction for pupils, effectively turning the nation's children into miniature fuel suppliers. Families would send them off with a single black treasure tucked under an arm, hoping to earn both warmth and approval. The poor often brought scraps, bits of wood, peat, or whatever hadn't already been burned at home. Lessons about geometry or grammar were frequently interrupted by the sound of the fire dying with a hiss, followed by a collective groan as the temperature plummeted again. Discipline, as always, remained firm. The Edwardian education system operated under the belief that discomfort built character. A brisk mind needs brisk air, proclaimed one educational reformer, who clearly owned a fireplace. Teachers believed that the cold kept students alert, though most children were only alert to the fact that they couldn't feel their noses. Punishment still occurred, though the dreaded cane lost much of its sting when your hands were too numb to feel it. Recess offered little relief. The playground was a frozen wasteland where snowballs flew and noses dripped. Children kicked at the ice in their boots until their toes reappeared, while teachers stood watch, stamping their feet and pretending this counted as supervision. Some schools organised warming exercises, essentially mandatory jumping sessions meant to stave off frostbite. Others simply rang the bell early, herding shivering students back indoors to freeze in formation. Despite everything, there was a peculiar sense of pride in enduring it. Parents praised their children for attending school no matter the weather, conveniently ignoring that the alternative was sitting at home in equal misery. Newspapers romanticised the hardy British pupil trudging through snowdrifts to pursue knowledge, though they neglected to mention how often those pupils arrived with ink-stained mittens and runny noses. For the children, there were small victories. When the teacher wasn't looking, they'd huddle together under desks, share a brick warmed from home, or sneak closer to the stove under the guise of picking up dropped pencils. In moments of collective rebellion, someone might toss a snowball into the classroom through an open door in an act of pure chaos that briefly united everyone in laughter and shrieking. And then there were the snow days, rare, mythical, and celebrated like national holidays. If the snow piled high enough to block the schoolhouse door, it was divine intervention. No one questioned it. Parents pretended disappointment, teachers feigned regret, and children immediately began their next round of frostbitten adventures outside. By spring, when the thaw finally came, the students emerged like hibernating creatures blinking into the light. The ink flowed again, desks dried out, and everyone marvelled at how luxurious room temperature felt. Still, they'd carry memories of that bitter season. The smell of damp wool, the sound of crackling frost under boots, the sight of their own breath hanging in the air above unfinished sums. For all the misery, those icebox classrooms produced a kind of resilience textbooks could never teach. The children of 1908 didn't just learn reading and arithmetic, they learned endurance, improvisation, and how to hold a pen with frozen fingers and still write something worth keeping. Because in Edwardian Britain, education wasn't only about knowledge, it was about surviving the lesson long enough to remember it. There are winters that make you uncomfortable, and then there are winters that try to assassinate you. The endless chill of 1908 belonged to the latter category. Every cough sounded like a death announcement, every sniffle a potential obituary. The Edwardians had survived cold homes, colder schools, and even colder baths, but now came the true test, the season of illness. Colds, pneumonia, influenza, bronchitis, chilblains, and every other ailment that could be spelled in Latin descended upon the population like an uninvited army. And their defence? Medicine in 1908 1 part bravery, 2 parts blind faith, and a dash of alcohol. Doctors of the era worked heroically, though often in ways that make modern medicine look like sorcery. The germ theory of disease was now accepted and theoretically, but antibiotics were still a distant dream, and most remedies hovered somewhere between superstition and intoxication. Cough? Have some whiskey. Fever? Whiskey with lemon. Pneumonia? Better whiskey, preferably neat. Entire pharmacies could have doubled as pubs. Every home had its own medicine chest, usually a collection of bottles filled with dubious liquids and misplaced confidence. Castor oil for cleansing, camphor for respiration, laudanum for quieting the nerves, and carbolic acid for, well, whatever you were desperate enough to use it for. Some families swore by mustard poultices, smearing the burning paste onto chests and backs to draw out the sickness, which it did, along with tears and skin. The treatment's effectiveness was questionable. The entertainment value for everyone else, undeniable. For colds, Edwardians had an impressive range of cures that all sounded like dares. A popular one involved soaking a pair of socks in vinegar, warming them by the fire, and wearing them to bed. Supposedly it restored circulation. In reality, it restored your awareness of smell. Another remedy suggested rubbing goose fat on the chest, wrapping oneself in flannel, and waiting for either recovery or acceptance. A common cold wasn't a medical condition. It was a domestic performance, complete with homespun theatrics and strong smells. When home remedies failed, and they often did, people summoned the family doctor. He arrived in a horse-drawn carriage, a leather bag in hand, and the grave expression of a man whose most powerful tool was hope. Consultations were brief but theatrical. The doctor would take a pulse, peer down a throat with a candle, and pronounce something reassuringly vague, a chill up the lungs, a catarrhal condition, or the ever-popular, you must rest. Then came the prescription, likely a tonic. Ah, the Edwardian tonic, a marvel of marketing and mild intoxication. Bottles labelled Dr. Forthright's lung invigorator, or Mrs. Blenkin's universal restorative promised to cure everything from coughs to existential dread. Their ingredients were simple: alcohol, sugar, and a hint of something alarming like chloroform or strychnine to stimulate vitality. People swore by them. Entire advertisements showed smiling families proclaiming, "Mother's cough is gone and so is her gloom." Unsurprisingly, both outcomes were connected. The poor, meanwhile, relied on simpler cures, mainly whatever was cheap, hot, and available. Street vendors sold steaming cups of medicinal broth, which was either soup or regret. Public baths offered health waters, and some charitable institutions distributed free tonic tea, brewed from herbs that tasted suspiciously like boiled weeds. For those truly desperate, there was always the chemist's corner bottle labelled for coughs and various complaints, an all-purpose liquid that might ease symptoms, clean the floor, or strip paint. Diseases spread fast in the crowded cities. London's slums, with their damp walls and overworked lungs, were breeding grounds for misery. A single sneeze on a tram could doom an entire family by week's end. Pneumonia was the silent killer of the season. The old man's friend, as doctors grimly called it, because it ended things quickly. Influenza swept through like gossip, sparing no class. Rich or poor all coughed in unison, a national symphony of congestion. Children caught everything. Schools became germ factories with chalkboards. Mothers did their best, rubbing vapo-like salves made from turpentine and lard, or brewing onion syrup by steeping onions in sugar overnight. Smelled as good as you think. If that didn't work, there was always the terrifying cold bath cure, where you were dunked in freezing water to shock the system into health. It worked wonders if your goal was to replace a cold with lifelong distrust of your parents. Pharmacies flourished, of course. Behind their polished counters stood men in spotless aprons, ready to mix your fate by hand. Ingredients were weighed on brass scales with ceremony, powders funneled into brown bottles, and labels applied with ominous precision. Take thrice daily. With courage, one might read. Few questioned their contents. If it burned, fizzed, or numbed your tongue, it was assumed to be working. And yet, amidst all this pseudo-scientific enthusiasm, there was genuine care. Neighbours looked out for each other, bringing broth, blankets and advice nobody asked for. Churches organised sick visits, while charities distributed coal and cod liver oil, the latter being the most dreaded of all remedies. A spoon a day keeps the undertaker away, Mother had insisted, as children gagged and swore eternal vengeance. By February, entire towns were coughing in chorus. Newspaper editorials urged calm and fortitude, doctors ran out of supplies, quack healers thrived, and yet somehow most people survived, not because of mustard whiskey or divine intervention, but because the human body is remarkably stubborn. When spring finally came and the air thawed, so did the spirits. Streets echoed not with coughs, but with laughter again. People cleaned out their medicine cupboards, poured away the last sticky drops of tonics, and vowed, as always, to live more sensibly next winter. They never did. But the illness season of 1908 left its mark. It taught Edwardians a peculiar lesson, that hope, community, and a strong liver could accomplish almost anything. They might not have had antibiotics, but they had determination, superstition, and plenty of whiskey, and honestly that was enough to get through one very long, very sniffling winter. There are few things as uniquely British as the determination to attend church no matter the weather, even if the Almighty himself might have stayed home with a hot drink. During the endless winter of 1908, faith was tested not just in doctrine but in temperature. The pews were frozen, the air was arctic, and every hymn was a duet between choir and chattering teeth. Amen and A-chew became a package deal. On Sunday mornings, church bells rang out across snowbound towns like polite reminders that salvation waited, though it might involve frostbite. Families trudged through knee-high drifts, bundled in layers of wool, faith, and misplaced optimism. Breath hung in clouds before them like incense, and the path to holiness was paved in ice. Yet they came anyway, because it was what good Edwardians did. A respectable family did not skip church, and even if their limbs might later require defrosting. Stepping inside the church brought no relief. The walls, made of stone and piety, held the cold like a grudge. The air was so crisp it could have been bottled and sold as punishment. Most churches had no heating system at all, relying instead on the body heat of the congregation, which would have worked splendidly if Edwardians hadn't believed in personal space. The organist's breath fogged over the pipes, turning every note into a faint wheeze. Stained glass windows glittered with frost, transforming biblical scenes into frozen dioramas of endurance. Those lucky enough to sit near the pulpit or in the choir loft might receive a faint blessing of warmth from a small stove, but the rest sat stoically in their icy pews, clutching prayer books with stiff fingers. Hymnals were like chilled iron plates, pages turned reluctantly, sticking together from condensation. Every cough echoed like thunder through the nave. The smell of wet wool and pipe smoke mingled with incense until holiness itself smelled vaguely of mildew. Clergy, of course, faced their own frozen trials. The vicar's robes offered little insulation against the draught howling through the chancel. Breath steamed visibly as they preached about eternal flames, a concept that sounded increasingly appealing to everyone present. The more passionate the sermon, the louder the congregation sniffled in agreement. "The fire of righteousness burns within us," cried one reverend, while several parishioners whispered, "Would that it did." The pew cushions, thin relics of comfort, might as well have been slabs of granite. Parishioners shifted constantly, trying to coax blood flow back into their legs without drawing the vicar's glare. Children fidgeted, not from boredom but self-preservation, their small boots knocking against the pews like Morse code for weir freezing. Parents maintained composure with the serene stiffness of statues. Even the choir boys, brave little soldiers of harmony, sang hymns with blue lips and the desperate hope that high notes might generate friction. Lighting was another ordeal. Candles flickered wildly in the draught, sending shadows dancing across the frost-covered altar. The combination of smoke and breath fog turned the interior into something between a chapel and a sauna, If saunas could induce pneumonia, the smell of tallow and wax clung to coats long after the service, a scented souvenir of spiritual survival. Church fashion, of course, remained immaculate. Even in bitter cold, Edwardians dressed for judgment, both divine and social. Ladies arrived in towering hats, veils stiff with frost, and gloves so tight they couldn't hold the hymn book properly. Gentlemen wore wool coats buttoned to the chin, top hats perched at angles that said, "I may perish, but I'll look respectable doing it." No one dared appear in anything resembling practical clothing. God might forgive sins, but society never forgave bad tailoring. And then there was the music. The organ wheezed like an asthmatic walrus, while the choir valiantly attempted harmony between shivers. Instruments went out of tune faster than the congregation's enthusiasm, yet somehow the hymn still soared, partly out of devotion, partly because stamping your feet in rhythm helped circulation. Nothing built spiritual unity quite like a collective struggle against hypothermia. Communion was a chilling affair. The wine meant to symbolize the warmth of divine grace was often nearly frozen. Parishioners sipped it reverently, grimacing as it numbed their teeth. Wafers cracked audibly in the dry air. The phrase "body and blood of Christ" felt unusually literal when your own felt like it was about to stop circulating. Despite all this, attendance rarely faltered. Churches weren't just spiritual centres, they were social ones. Skipping Sunday service risked not only your soul but your reputation. The pews were places to be seen, alliances to be forged, gossip to be exchanged discreetly under the guise of piety. "I hear Mrs. Langley's cough persists," whispered one parishioner. "Yes," replied another. "But she does have new gloves." In poorer parishes, faith was even more practical. The church offered warmth, not much, but enough to draw people in. Soup kitchens and charity drives often operated alongside Sunday sermons. A bowl of hot broth could convert even the most sceptical atheist. Priests made their rounds with pastoral cheer, armed with both scripture and spare blankets. When the final hymn faded and the congregation shuffled out, boots crunching on the snow, there was a peculiar sense of triumph. They had survived another service, another week, another frostbitten amen. Outside, the air bit at their faces, but spirits were high. The promise of roast beef and a small fire at home made salvation feel just a little closer. For all its discomfort, there was beauty in that frostbitten faith. The sight of candlelight flickering through icy windows, the voices rising in unison against the cold, spoke to something deep and stubborn in the Edwardian soul. They might have frozen fingers, numb toes, and streaming noses, but their devotion and their sense of duty remained unshakable. In the end, church in 1908 wasn't just about worship. It was about endurance, proof that neither blizzards nor drafts nor frozen hymnals could extinguish the British spirit. After all, if you could survive a 2-hour sermon in sub-zero temperatures, eternity didn't seem quite so intimidating. Charity was when someone slightly warmer noticed you still breathing. The endless winter of 1908 was merciless to the poor, a season that turned survival into a full-time occupation. For the working classes and the homeless of Edwardian Britain, warmth wasn't just comfort, it was currency. And the streets, cold and pitiless, were a daily reminder that frostbite didn't care about class, but society certainly did. By January, the cobbled streets of London, Manchester, and Glasgow had become frozen maps of despair. Ice glazed the gutters, slush turned to stone, and the poor shuffled through it in boots with more holes than leather. Men wrapped newspaper around their feet, women tied shawls tighter, and children learned to run not from joy but from the wind. The city was a great frostbitten organism, its heart still beating but slowly. Those lucky enough to have roofs over their heads faced the cold behind thin walls and thinner blankets. Coal was scarce and expensive, and a single scuttle might cost more than a day's wages. Families huddled together for warmth, their breath mingling in the dark, the air thick with the smell of damp and smoke. Pots of broth simmered weakly on stoves that coughed more than they burned. In tenement blocks, frost formed on the inside of windows, lace patterns prettier than anything the residents could afford. Outside, the truly destitute took to the streets. London's homeless population swelled as workers lost jobs to frozen factories and closed docks. The embankments along the Thames became camps of misery, where men wrapped in rags slept beside fires made from scavenged wood, or more often from furniture someone else had thrown away. The city authorities occasionally cleared them out, as if tidying up the frostbite would improve appearances. Workhouses offered relief, though that word stretched the definition of mercy. These grim institutions promised shelter and food in exchange for labour and obedience. The food was lukewarm, the beds colder, and the rules relentless. Men broke stones, women scrubbed, children stitched, all under the watchful eye of overseers who mistook cruelty for efficiency. Yet people still lined up at the gates, because anything, even drudgery, was better than freezing to death under a bridge. Then there were the casual wards, the nightly shelters of last resort. Long lines formed before dusk, stretching down icy alleys as the desperate waited for a chance to sleep indoors. Admission meant surrendering your clothes to fumigation, enduring cold baths, and sharing a straw mattress with strangers. But for many, it was a small salvation. Newspapers reported hundreds turned away nightly, their headlines written with pity that never quite reached Parliament. Charities did what they could. Soup kitchens ladled out thin broth and thick sympathy. Volunteers from churches and missions distributed blankets, bread, and tracts on repentance. The Salvation Army marched through the frost, beating drums and hope in equal measure. In poorer districts, publicans offered penny sit-ups, a chair and a roof for the night, if you could stay awake. Sleep cost extra. The gap between rich and poor had never looked starker or warmer. While the wealthy sipped cocoa by roaring fireplaces, the poor warmed their hands over street grates. Upper-class ladies organised coal drives and blanket funds, posing for newspapers beside heaps of donations they would never touch themselves. The intentions were often kind, the execution unintentionally theatrical. As one cynic put it, charity is the art of feeling virtuous in gloves. Yet amidst the frost and filth, there was resilience, that stubborn Edwardian kind that refused to die quietly. Street sellers still called their wares through chapped lips. Match girls, their fingers cracked and raw, sang songs between sales. Crossing sweepers cleared ice for pennies, while cabmen shared tea brewed over small stoves inside their carriages. Even beggars developed a grim humour. "Spare a coin," one was heard to say, "or I'll haunt you as an icicle." Children, ever defiant, turned hardship into play. They skated on frozen puddles, built snowmen out of soot-streaked snow, and competed to catch falling flakes on their tongues. Laughter, thin as it was, echoed through alleyways, a fragile sound that refused to vanish. Mothers watched from doorways, arms crossed against the cold, pride and worry mixed in equal measure. As the weeks dragged on, newspapers began to take notice. "Distress in the East End," one headline read, though distress was putting it lightly. Relief funds were organised, soup kitchens expanded, even Parliament debated emergency measures, though most of those measures involved committees which, as history has proven, generate more paper than warmth. The poor learned not to wait for salvation from Westminster. They made their own, with coal scraps, shared loaves and stubborn hearts. By late February, the thaw began. Streets turned from white to grey, revealing what the frost had hidden: broken carts, collapsed sheds, and lives that had endured another winter by sheer force of will. The newspapers congratulated the nation on its spirit of endurance, as if endurance were optional. The rich resumed their normal lives, the poor their eternal improvisation. But the winter of 1908 left its mark on the streets, not just in the cracks of the cobblestones, but in the collective memory of those who'd survived it. It taught them that warmth was fleeting, charity conditional, and survival communal. The poor of Britain had been tested and, as always, had passed. Not with comfort or praise, but with the quiet dignity of people who knew that frost could only break you if you stopped moving. And so they kept moving, through the snow, through the hunger, through the bitter wind that howled like the voice of a landlord collecting rent. For them, spring wasn't just a season, it was proof that even the coldest empire couldn't freeze out hope entirely. When the winter of 1908 decided to freeze Britain like a poorly stored pudding, survival often depended on one thing: finding somewhere, anywhere, that was warmer than home. For those who couldn't afford extra coal or a roaring fire, public warmth became an unofficial national institution. Bathhouses, pubs, train stations and department stores turned into sanctuaries for the frozen masses, places where one could thaw both fingers and dignity. Nothing unites a nation like pretending to shop just to feel your toes again. Let's begin with the most respectable refuge of all, the public bathhouse. Before plumbing and private bathrooms became commonplace, bathhouses were the great social equalizer. Anyone with a penny and a pulse could wash, warm, and briefly forget the cold. Inside, condensation clung to the tiled walls like fog in miniature. The sound of dripping pipes mingled with the sighs of relief from people who hadn't felt warm water on their skin since summer. Hot steam rose like salvation itself. For many working-class Londoners, a weekly bath was less about hygiene and more about basic survival, a chance to unfreeze the joints and remember what circulation felt like. Municipal bathhouses also doubled as social clubs. Neighbours exchanged gossip over the splash of buckets, while attendants clanked pipes and hollered about proper usage. Men emerged pink, towel-clad and reborn, while women lingered in the warm air as long as the attendants allowed. In some neighbourhoods, bathhouses even offered small warming rooms, where customers could sit by radiators and read newspapers until guilt, or closing time, drove them out. You could leave feeling cleansed, uplifted, and mildly boiled. For those seeking warmth of a different kind, the pub was the eternal fallback. Edwardian pubs glowed like lanterns in the snow, drawing in shivering souls with promises of ale, stew, and gossip. Inside, the air was thick with pipe smoke, laughter, and humanity. The fire roared, tankards clinked, and boots steamed by the hearth. Pubs were the people's parliament, places where men debated politics, football, and whether or not frostbite counted as an acceptable excuse for missing work. Women, when they ventured in, were treated to warmth, companionship, and unsolicited opinions from men who'd clearly been warming themselves since noon. The landlord's fireplace became a democratic miracle. Beggar and barrister alike could claim its glow, at least until the former's ale ran out. In the poorest districts, publicans even let patrons linger long after their last drink, understanding that a sleeping drunk was still better company than a frozen corpse on the doorstep. Pubs kept Britain alive that winter, one pint and one argument at a time. Train stations, meanwhile, became the kingdom of the cold wanderer. With their great glass roofs and constant motion, they offered a curious kind of warmth, not from fires, but from human congestion. Trains hissed, passengers bustled, and the air shimmered faintly with energy and steam. Homeless men pretended to wait for trains that never came. Women loitered near kiosks, clutching their shawls and watching the arrivals board like hopeful prophets. Station masters looked the other way, as long as the loiterers didn't block traffic or frighten the paying customers. Some families spent entire nights there, sleeping upright on benches, lulled by the rhythm of wheels on frozen rails. It was a peculiar kind of sanctuary, impersonal, transient, and slightly humiliating, but it worked. In the middle of winter's cruelty, the station became humanity's waiting room, filled with strangers united by a single thought. Please let spring arrive before the 9:05 to Manchester. And then there were the department stores, temples of consumer warmth. These glittering palaces of commerce, newly popular in Edwardian cities, offered more than luxury goods. They offered central heating. Even those who couldn't afford a button or a bar of soap could wander through the aisles pretending to browse. Whole families strolled beneath chandeliers, admiring silk dresses and mechanical toys they would never buy, just for the sweet relief of the unfrozen extremities. Store clerks knew exactly what was happening but tolerated it. A little frostbitten tourism never hurt business. The poor learned the art of thermal window shopping. Enter through the revolving door, admire a hat, inspect the china, gaze reverently at the furniture, and exit only when sensation returned to your feet. Mothers clutched their children's hands, whispering reminders not to touch anything, while men loitered in the glove section as if contemplating Christmas gifts rather than cherishing ambient warmth. Department stores became accidental democracies, cathedrals where everyone worshipped the god of central heating. Libraries and museums also drew crowds seeking warmth under the pretense of education. Readers sat in heavy coats at long oak tables, pretending to study while secretly defrosting their fingers on the pages. The British Museum became less a temple of knowledge and more a sophisticated sauna for scholars and the unemployed alike. Some visitors spent entire afternoons contemplating artifacts, by which they meant napping discreetly in room 4. Each of these spaces offered something essential that private homes could not: the illusion of comfort without cost. Public warmth wasn't just about physical heat, it was about belonging, about finding humanity in shared discomfort. In the bathhouse, you were cleansed beside your neighbours. In the pub, you thawed beside strangers. In the station, you lingered with wanderers. In the store, you stood among dreamers. And while the upper classes warmed themselves by ornate hearths and called it civilization, it was these public havens that truly kept the nation from freezing solid. They were Britain's unsung furnaces, humble, smoky, bustling, and gloriously alive. Because in that relentless winter, survival wasn't solitary. It was communal, improvised, and occasionally accompanied by a pint. And somewhere between the bath steam, the pub fire, and the department store's heated floorboards, Edwardians discovered the truest warmth of all: each other. Desperation, as the Edwardians discovered during the winter of 1908, is a superb motivator for both innovation and dishonesty. When the temperature dropped and legitimate coal became rarer than courtesy on the omnibus, Britain's black market lit up, literally. Suddenly, the empire's greatest natural resource wasn't just mined underground. It was manufactured, misrepresented, and occasionally exploded in people's grates. If it smoked, burned, or vaguely resembled carbon, someone tried to sell it. The great coal shortage was no mystery. Supplies had frozen solid in depots, railways were paralysed by snow, and miners couldn't extract enough to meet demand. Prices soared. Respectable families began eyeing their furniture as potential fuel, and the nation's ingenuity, or moral flexibility, flared to life. In back alleys and dubious warehouses, entrepreneurs discovered there was money to be made from anything that could burn for more than a minute without screaming. Enter the fake briquette. At first glance, these counterfeit coals looked perfectly legitimate. Neat, uniform blocks that promised clean burning efficiency. But appearances deceived. Inside, they were stuffed with everything from sawdust and clay to mud, manure, and the occasional shredded newspaper. Some even contained iron filings for weight. Proof that scammers understood one timeless economic truth: people equate heaviness with value. Advertisements boasted of patent smokeless briquettes, which was true in the sense that they didn't smoke, they just hissed, fizzled, and sometimes exploded. Housewives learned to spot the fakes the hard way. They'd buy a sack from a suspiciously friendly coalman offering a special price, only to discover the next morning that their hearth had turned into a kiln of regret. Instead of warmth, the room filled with choking fumes and the smell of scorched optimism. Newspapers began publishing warnings about adulterated fuels, and magistrates filled their dockets with cases that read like satire. Mrs. Phelps versus the Briquette Company for damages sustained from an exploding fire. Coal merchants naturally blamed everyone else. Some pointed fingers at foreign suppliers. Others insisted their employees had been misled by the unscrupulous middlemen. In truth, many were perfectly aware that their deliveries contained more filler than fuel. A typical scam involved mixing low-grade coal dust with pitch and pressing it into lumps, an operation that required little more than a mould, a shed, and a total lack of conscience. For every honest merchant freezing in his office, there were 3 cheerful rogues selling premium fire lumps made from whatever the horse left behind. Meanwhile, the government tried to restore order, though it mostly succeeded in producing paperwork. Officials issued stern proclamations about quality control, followed by committees to investigate the committees that had failed to prevent fraud. Inspectors were dispatched to weigh shipments, measure ash content, and occasionally warm their hands by confiscated fires. A few prosecutions made headlines, but most culprits vanished into the fog long before justice could thaw out enough to catch them. Even ordinary citizens got creative. In working-class neighbourhoods, people pooled resources to produce community fuel, a mixture of coal dust, potato peelings and glue, pressed into balls and dried on windowsills. It smoked like a factory on a judgment day, but it kept the kettle boiling. In rural areas, farmers burned dried peat, sticks, and whatever nature, or their neighbours, wouldn't miss. Furniture met fiery fates too, broken chairs, cracked bedsteads, and in one tragicomic incident, a piano that provided 10 glorious minutes of melody-scented heat. Of course, some of these homegrown solutions bordered on genius. Enterprising tinkers sold fuel bricks made from compressed paper, claiming they burned long and clean. Technically true, long if you measured in tears, clean if you ignored the choking soot. Even city councils experimented, mixing garbage ash with industrial tar to create municipal fuel. The results could ignite, or simply melt into something that resembled satanic porridge. Still, it was progress of a sort, the modern recycling movement's smelly ancestor. Where there's profit, there's marketing, and Edwardian advertisers did not disappoint. Posters for Baxter's brilliant briquettes promised twice the heat at half the cost, though customers soon discovered the slogan referred to the speed at which their curtains caught fire. Another brand, Home Glow Fuel, assured users of a cheerful flame without odour. It achieved this by producing both odour and melancholy in equal measure. Yet people kept buying, because the alternative was freezing, and human optimism burns hotter than any carbon substitute. As the fraud epidemic grew, so did public cynicism. Satirical newspapers published cartoons showing coalmen selling bags labelled guaranteed not to burn, while pamphleteers accused the government of letting profiteers rob the nation's hearth. The scandal even reached Parliament, where one humorless MP demanded an inquiry into the moral temperature of the coal trade. It was the only temperature rising that winter. Still, amid the dishonesty and despair, there was something undeniably human in the chaos. People were simply trying to stay alive, even if that meant bending a few ethical or chemical rules. For every crooked coalman, there were 10 ordinary citizens sharing what little real fuel they had with neighbours. Communities organised coal clubs, pooling small weekly payments to buy legitimate supplies in bulk. And when the thaw finally came, those who'd survived on dubious briquettes could laugh, mostly because they still had their eyebrows. By March, the great coal scams had burned themselves out. The con men moved on to selling miracle tonics and patriotic insurance plans, leaving behind a nation coated in soot and suspicion. But Britain had learned something valuable that winter. Desperation makes inventors of some, criminals of others, and comedians of everyone else. Because when the world freezes solid, honesty is a luxury, and warmth, no matter how counterfeit, feels real enough while it lasts. When the winter of 1908 clamped its icy jaws around Britain, no creature, 2-legged or 4, escaped its bite. Humans might have been clever enough to invent coal stoves and hot water bottles, but the animal kingdom had its own survival strategies. Some were ingenious, some pitiful, and some involved sleeping for 20 hours and looking smug about it. Dogs, it turned out, had the right idea. In cities, where frost coated the streets and every breath hung in the air like smoke signals from despair, animals were as much a part of survival as fireplaces and tea. Horses, cats, and dogs weren't merely companions, They were co-workers in the nation's ongoing war against the cold. The Edwardian relationship with animals was a mixture of sentimentality, practicality, and mild hypocrisy. People adored their pets, pitied strays, and still expected horses to haul half of London through snowdrifts the height of small children. Let's start with the horses. They were the engines of Edwardian life, the living machines that pulled carts, omnibuses, and milk deliveries no matter the weather. In the endless winter, their lot was miserable. Harnessed before dawn, they slogged through frozen slush, hooves slipping on icy cobbles, nostrils steaming like locomotives in distress. Drivers covered them in rough woolen blankets at rest stops, rubbing their legs with liniment to keep circulation going. Yet even the kindest owners couldn't stop frost from forming on manes or reins from stiffening in their hands. Horses were essential, overworked, and heartbreakingly stoic, the four-legged workforce of an empire pretending everything was fine. In the countryside, farmers' animals faced their own trials. Chickens froze on their perches, cows' udders nearly did the same, and pigs huddled together in communal confusion. Farmers went to absurd lengths to keep their stock alive, lighting fires in barns, wrapping foals in burlap, and feeding livestock extra grain for warmth. There were reports of chickens being brought into kitchens at night, not as dinner but as reluctant guests. Ducks waddled around barns looking offended by the solid ponds. Sheep grew icicles in their wool, which probably would have become a fashion trend had it happened in Mayfair. Cats, meanwhile, treated the entire ordeal as an elaborate joke at humanity's expense. While people layered themselves like lasagna and cursed frozen pipes, cats found the warmest spot in any house and claimed it. Kitchen hearth, taken. Lap by the fire, occupied. Clean laundry straight from the drying rack, property of the cat. They slunk through the winter like little emperors, their fur acting as both armour and arrogance. Stray cats, on the other hand, relied on back alleys, brewery vents, and human pity. Many Edwardians left scraps outside or cracked open cellar doors for them, partly out of compassion, partly to keep the mice population from staging its own winter uprising. Dogs, though, were the season's true philosophers. They didn't question the cold, they simply rearranged themselves around it. Lapdogs, the pampered elite of the animal world, spent the season reclining on cushions beside fireplaces, often wearing knitted coats or, in the case of spoiled terriers, actual velvet. The Edwardian love of canine fashion reached absurd heights. One London paper described a bulldog in a fur-lined jacket with mother-of-pearl buttons. Working dogs, on the other hand, didn't have such luxury. They guarded homes, herded sheep, and accompanied postal workers through blizzards with the stoic expression of creatures resigned to mankind's madness. Their reward? The occasional bone and a nap so deep it defied physics. Stables became the animal equivalent of coffee houses, loud, steamy, and full of gossip, if you spoke horse. They were some of the few places in Britain that actually stayed warm all winter. The body heat of several animals, combined with the smell of hay, sweat, and manure, created an atmosphere both unpleasant and life-saving. Stable boys practically lived there, feeding and brushing the horses while stealing bits of warmth for themselves. The air might have been thick enough to slice, but it was better than the frost outside. Birds, too, captured public sympathy that winter. Newspapers encouraged people to feed the robins, publishing sentimental sketches of little birds perched on snow-covered windowsills. Families sprinkled crumbs and seeds on ledges, as if making amends for humanity's general indifference of the rest of the year. It became a small ritual of decency in an otherwise harsh season, one that made even the grimmest Londoner feel momentarily kind. Not every human-animal interaction was noble, of course. Rat catchers thrived in the cold as the rodents fled frost for pantries and basements. Ferrets were the unsung heroes of winter pest control, slinking through walls like furry plumbers with teeth. Their handlers, often ragged and reeking of tobacco, made a living keeping cities from turning into indoor zoos. Then there were the street animals, the invisible companions of the poor. Stray dogs wandered the alleyways, surviving on scraps, keeping lonely night watchmen company, and curling beside beggars beneath bridges. many stories circulated of dogs sharing what little warmth they had with their human friends lying pressed against them under threadbare coats. They were loyalty made tangible, silent partners in the season's suffering. The wealthy, meanwhile, discovered philanthropy through their pets. Animal charities like the RSPCA saw donations spike as society ladies cooed over the plight of our four-legged friends. Fundraisers were held to provide blankets for horses and shelters for strays. In one particularly fashionable gesture, a duchess reportedly donated her fur stole to cover a greyhound. Critics noted it was last season's fur, but charity is charity. By March, as the thaw finally crept in, Britain's animals emerged thinner, scruffier and wiser. Horses shook out their manes and resumed pulling the Empire's wagons. Cats resumed their reigns over windowsills. Dogs stretched, yawned, and looked pleased with themselves, as if to say, "I told you so." The birds sang again, and mostly to announce that they'd survived humanity's generosity. The Edwardians, for all their elegance and stubbornness, learned a quiet lesson that winter. Survival wasn't just a human enterprise. Every creature in the Empire, from pampered lapdog to frostbitten crow, had shared in the struggle. And in their small, enduring ways, the animals had reminded the people of something vital. Warmth isn't just a temperature, it's a connection. And so, as the first hints of spring touched the frozen fields, Britain sighed in collective relief. The stables steamed, the hearths crackled, and somewhere in a parlour a spoiled terrier snored by the fire, dreaming of next winter's velvet coat, because in Edwardian Britain, even survival came with a touch of style. While Britain shivered through its homegrown misery in '08, the chill was not content to stay local. The cold stretched its icy fingers across the globe, touching every corner of the empire, from the fog-choked ports of Canada to the wind-blown outposts of India. It was as though the entire British Empire had joined in a single reluctant experiment to see just how far morale could drop before tea froze solid. Somewhere in the empire, a man was writing in his diary, "Still cold, regret everything." Let's start with the crown's frostiest jewel. Canada. The Dominion's winters were legendary even before 1908 decided to outdo itself. In Montreal, the mercury plummeted so low that telegraph wires snapped, milk froze in its bottles, and even polite conversation was abbreviated for warmth. Canadians, however, wore their frostbite like medals of honour. Lumbermen trudged through forests so silent that every axe blow sounded like an argument with nature itself. Farmers thawed frozen wells with gunpowder, and schoolchildren learned that frostbite counted as both an excuse and a character-building exercise. Across the Atlantic, India was having an entirely different crisis, a cold snap that confused everyone. In Delhi, where winter normally meant slightly less unbearable, temperatures dropped low enough for British officers to put on 2 layers of linen and complain in telegrams to London. Colonial newspapers ran astonished headlines like, "Morning chill felt in Calcutta, residents alarmed." Meanwhile, the local population politely refrained from pointing out that the same temperature back in Manchester would have been considered refreshing. Still, the Raj's winter was symbolic, a reminder that even empire couldn't negotiate with the weather. Further east, in the outposts of Hong Kong and Singapore, the chill was less physical than cultural. British expatriates hosted winter teas in mild weather, dressing in wool and pretending to shiver for authenticity. Society ladies declared that one must feel seasonal, even if one must fake it. Ice was imported, not for cooling drinks, but for constructing decorative frost scenes in hotel lobbies. The colonies might not have had snow, but they made up for it in effort, and arguably delusion. Down in the southern hemisphere, Australia and New Zealand faced their own version of the empire's cold shoulder. Reports from New South Wales described an uncharacteristically harsh season, with crops failing and sheep huddling in the thousands. Newspapers joked that English weather followed us out of spite. Farmers cursed both the climate and the imperial trade policies, while city dwellers celebrated the novelty of breath you could actually see. In New Zealand, the Maoris joked that the British had brought not just empire, but frost. And then, of course, there were the explorers, those magnificent Edwardian optimists who looked at a map of the poles and thought, that looks habitable. The early 20th century was the age of Arctic and Antarctic obsession, and 1908 sat squarely in the middle of Britain's most heroic and occasionally foolish era of exploration. Take Ernest Shackleton's Nimrod expedition to Antarctica, which had launched just months before the cold hit Britain. While Londoners grumbled about frozen pipes, Shackleton's crew faced temperatures so brutal that ink froze in pens mid-sentence. One diary entry read simply, -40, soup froze before it could be eaten. They slept beside their sled dogs, rationed biscuits that shattered like glass, and kept spirits up by singing hymns with the kind of enthusiasm only possible when you're too cold to think about mortality. Shackleton's leadership was legendary, equal parts courage and caffeine deprivation. He once described the Antarctic as a fine place for reflection, which is the polite British way of saying, I may have lost several toes, but at least there's peace and quiet. Meanwhile, in the Canadian Arctic, explorers charting the Northwest Passage reported that compasses froze and ink refused to flow, forcing them to carve notes into wood. They joked that their tea ration could double as construction material. Letters sent home took months to arrive, and when they did, they often read like resignation letters to civilization. Still here, one Arctic officer wrote, still cold, still English. Even the Royal Navy wasn't immune to winter's contempt. Ships stationed from the Falklands to Malta dealt with rigging coated in ice and sailors sleeping in hammocks stiff with frost. Admirals issued stern memoranda about proper frost precautions, as though discipline could bully the weather into submission. On deck, men took turns chipping ice off ropes, while muttering that the Empire might be large, but the blankets weren't. And let's not forget the mail. The global postal network, that proud artery of imperial communication, nearly froze over. Letters took weeks longer to reach their destinations, delayed by snow-blocked trains, frozen rivers, and postmen whose moustaches had become personal ecosystems of ice. Somewhere in the far reaches of the Empire, a lonely official likely received a long-awaited message from London reading, "Hope the weather has improved." Yet, in its peculiar way, the cold unified the Empire. From Scottish crofters to Indian clerks, Canadians to Cape Towners, everyone was talking about the same thing, the weather, a truly imperial conversation topic. Shared discomfort proved to be one of Britain's most enduring exports. By the time the thaw came, the Empire had survived through sheer obstinacy and mutual commiseration. Explorers limped home to fanfare, colonials resumed complaining about heat, and Britons returned to pretending they preferred a bracing chill. The frozen empire had endured, its pipes cracked, its tempers tested, and its diaries full of the kind of stoic understatement only the British could pull off. If the winter of 1908 had a legacy, it was this. No matter where you lived under the Union Jack, you could always count on two things, the weather being awful, and someone somewhere insisting that it built character. In Edwardian Britain, warmth was more than a matter of comfort. It was a form of currency. The winter of 1908 didn't just freeze rivers and pipes. It froze the illusion that everyone suffered equally. When the mercury plummeted, so did the pretense of social harmony. The poor burned furniture, the middle class rationed coal, and the rich simply left. When life gives you frostbite, make it a vacation. For the working classes, warmth was a daily negotiation between survival and dignity. Every stick of furniture, every scrap of wood, every shred of cloth became potential fuel. Entire neighbourhoods smelled faintly of desperation and oak varnish. Families eyed broken chairs not as heirlooms, but as firewood with sentimental value. Newspapers printed grim accounts of households reduced to burning picture frames, sometimes with the family portraits still inside. "Better warm than remembered," one paper joked darkly. Coal, the black gold of the age, had become a luxury item. The price of a single sack could swallow half a week's wage, if it was available at all. Some families joined coal clubs, pooling their pennies to buy in bulk, while others resorted to collecting the scraps that fell from delivery carts. Children scoured alleys for lumps that had rolled loose, known as coal picking, a practice so common it inspired both pity and moral panic. Respectable society debated whether it was an act of industriousness or a symptom of moral decay. In reality, it was neither. It was just cold. The middle class, ever preoccupied with appearances, faced a different dilemma: how to maintain propriety while quietly freezing. They couldn't exactly burn their pianos or beg in the streets. So they perfected the art of respectable discomfort. Drawing rooms were heated just enough to imply wealth, but not enough to cause relaxation. Families gathered around the single glowing hearth like penguins in lace collars, pretending to find it cosy. Guests were offered tea so hot it could melt the illusion for a few minutes. Dinner parties featured subtle competition, not over cuisine, but over who could serve dessert without visible shivering. Even the servants, those human cogs of domestic comfort, noticed the divide growing starker. Upstairs the fire roared. Downstairs it barely sputtered. Some mistresses rationed coal for staff quarters to teach thrift. The result was that the butler froze with dignity, while ensuring the family remained toasty and ignorant. Letters to household advice columns brimmed with questions like, how might one reduce heating costs without appearing mean? The short answer, of course, was to be rich. And the rich, oh, they had options. While the lower classes huddled by fading embers, the upper crust discovered an entirely new coping mechanism: leaving. The invention of the winter holiday was less about leisure and more about strategic migration. Wealthy Edwardians boarded trains bound for France, Italy, or the Riviera, claiming it was for health, as though frostbite were a diagnosis. Travel brochures promised Mediterranean air, restorative sun, and civility unfrozen. By February, half the British elite had relocated to climates where the only ice came in cocktails. The newspapers gleefully chronicled these escapes. "Duchess flees the Fost," one headline announced, as if courage were optional. Grand hotels in Nice and Cannes filled with Britons wearing wool by habit and disdain by choice. They sent postcards home showing palm trees and blue skies, often inscribed with something like, "Wish you were warm." Back in London, factory workers were wishing the same thing, minus the sarcasm. Even among the wealthy there were degrees of privilege. The truly affluent could afford second homes, winter residences, complete with marble fireplaces and imported coal. Those of merely comfortable means settled for the sun-spa towns of southern England, where tepid baths and tepid conversation passed for luxury. The growing industry of travel agents and health resorts quietly thanked the weather for boosting business. The phrase seasonal migration was coined by scientists. The rich simply called it good sense. But the price of warmth wasn't just economic, it was moral. The winter exposed how dependent society had become on the illusion of progress. Britain, the empire of steam and steel, had conquered continents but not the common cold. Newspapers printed sermons urging charity, share thy coal with thy neighbour, while the same pages advertised imported fur coats. Reformers decried the scandal of frost in a modern nation. Politicians responded with speeches that generated more heat than actual fires. Still, not all hearts were frozen. Acts of quiet compassion abounded. Wealthy matrons funded coal tickets, distributing vouchers for fuel to the poor. Churches hosted warm nights where families could gather under candlelight and temporary peace. In the slums, neighbours shared stoves, blankets and gossip in equal measure. Warmth became a communal act, a rebellion against the coldness of circumstance. When spring finally arrived, Britain exhaled as one. The rich returned from Italy with tans, the middle class restocked their coal cellars, and the poor swept the ashes of another winter out their doorways. Yet something fundamental had shifted. The cold had made visible what class pretended to hide. That privilege burns longer, and poverty burns faster. The winter of 1908 taught the empire a simple equation. Comfort equaled capital. Those with money could buy warmth, mobility, and even health. Those without had only resourcefulness and community to keep the chill at bay. And though the ice eventually melted, the memory of that frozen divide lingered like smoke in the air, a reminder that warmth was never truly free. Still, in the uniquely British way, everyone declared victory. The poor called it endurance, the middle class called it fortitude, and the rich called it a marvellous season abroad. And when the next winter came, as it always did, the cycle would repeat, with one difference. Everyone, no matter their station, would agree on one universal truth. A good fire costs more than coal. If the winter of 1908 had an official Edwardian motto, it would have been simple: suffer beautifully. The empire might have been freezing solid, but heaven forbid anyone admit it. Complaining was gauche, shivering was undignified, and turning blue was simply another shade of refinement. The Edwardians, masters of appearances, turned endurance into performance. They didn't just endure the cold, they curated it. For the upper and aspiring middle classes, public image mattered more than body temperature. Social etiquette dictated that one must never appear rattled by anything as common as weather. While the poor huddled around fires and the working class wrapped themselves in practicality, the well-to-do wrapped themselves in poise. Winter wasn't an inconvenience. It was an accessory. Pale skin, rosy cheeks, and a slightly frosted expression were the height of seasonal chic. Evidence not of hypothermia, but of character. In polite society there existed an unspoken rule. If you were cold, you were probably doing something right. Ladies walked arm in arm through icy parks, parasols replaced by mufflers, faces set in smiles so tight they could shatter. They called it taking the air, though it was less about pleasure and more about survival by denial. Their cheeks glowed from the wind's cruelty, but compliments flowed freely. "My dear, you look radiant." Translation: "Your capillaries are in revolt." For gentlemen, the rules were even stricter. The Edwardian male was expected to meet frost with stoic indifference, a sort of chilly heroism in a bowler hat. Whether standing on train platforms or striding down Pall Mall, men kept their posture erect, their collars high, and their expressions somewhere between mildly amused and nearly deceased. Moustaches froze like delicate chandeliers of dignity. The well-groomed gentleman would never chip away the ice, he simply pretended it added gravitas. Fashion did its best to pretend it was helping. Women's clothing, with its layers of corsets, chemises, petticoats and skirts, trapped both heat and misery. Long wool coats, fur muffs and high collars were all the rage, not because they worked, but because they looked like they might. A lady could freeze elegantly as long as she did it in matching gloves. Men layered waistcoats beneath thick overcoats, creating silhouettes that suggested prosperity and mild suffocation. The favoured fabric of the season was tweed, beloved for its durability and loathed for its itchiness, which at least proved one still had sensation left. Social gatherings offered another arena for performative warmth. Dinner parties and balls continued unabated, despite the temperature inside resembling that of a well-kept mausoleum. Guests arrived red-nosed and trembling, only to immediately declare, "How perfectly cosy." Servants discreetly defrosted champagne bottles near the kitchen stove, and pianists wore fingerless gloves to keep the music moving. If conversation lagged, one could always rely on a witty remark about the weather, specifically how it builds fortitude. Everyone nodded in agreement while privately fantasizing about emigrating to Italy. Newspapers joined in on the charade. Editorials praised British hardiness, contrasting it with the fragile temperaments of continental nations. One columnist triumphantly wrote, "A little frost does the national spirit good. It stiffens our resolve." The irony was lost on readers trying to thaw their newspapers over the breakfast fire. Magazines featured cheerful illustrations of families smiling by frosted windows, captioned with lines like, "The English home," "All was warm within." It wasn't true, but it was patriotic. Even advertising adapted to this culture of dignified suffering. Soap brands claimed to restore glow to winter skin, hat companies promised that style alone wards off chill, and whiskey manufacturers ran bold campaigns insisting that a dram a day keeps the frost away. Society swallowed it all, along with the whiskey. There was something distinctly Edwardian about turning a national endurance test into a shopping opportunity. In public, one had to keep up the performance. To show discomfort was to risk social embarrassment. Imagine the horror of being sotted rubbing your hands together for warmth on Bond Street. No, better to suffer silently, to keep one's scarf stylishly loose, even as the wind threatened to remove one's ears. The British stiff upper lip wasn't just metaphorical that winter, it was physically frozen. Private moments, however, told another story. Behind closed doors, families engaged in the sacred ritual of thawing out. Boots steamed by the fire, stockings hung like flags of surrender, and the air filled with the sound of saws, the national anthem of exhaustion. Letters and diaries from the period reveal the truth beneath the glamour. Went to luncheon at Mrs. Carter's. Delightful conversation. Nearly lost a toe, one woman wrote. Another gentleman noted, the club was beastly cold, but everyone insisted it was invigorating. I am beginning to suspect mass delusion. Even the arts reflected this paradox. Painters depicted serene winter landscapes with skaters and snow-covered bridges, conveniently omitting the chilblains. Poets waxed lyrical about brisk mornings and crisp air, romanticising frost as if it weren't actively trying to kill them. It was beauty through gritted teeth. And yet this peculiar combination of vanity and resilience defined the Edwardian response to hardship. The ability to endure discomfort with elegance was seen as proof of breeding. To suffer without complaint was not just admirable, it was expected. The cold might have been democratic, but dignity was decidedly not. By the time the thaw arrived, the nation emerged not triumphant, but impeccably posed. The Edwardians had turned frost into theatre, a performance of grace under literal pressure. They may have been half frozen, but they looked marvellous doing it. Because in the grand hierarchy of Edwardian values, warmth was optionals, but appearances were eternal. And so, with rosy cheeks, numb fingers, and unbent posture, they endured the unendurable, proving once and for all that the British didn't just keep calm and carry on. They kept calm, carried on, and made it look fabulous. History remembers the winter of 1908 as a season of frost and hardship, but the best record of it wasn't in government archives or newspaper editorials. It lived in ink, smudged by trembling hands, frozen mid-sentence by temperatures that turned every diary entry into an endurance test. If you want to know what the Great Edwardian Freeze felt like, just look at the handwriting, shaky, blotchy, and occasionally interrupted by what historians can only describe as cold-induced profanity. Even ink gave up halfway through. History's first rage quit. Across Britain, letter writing was still the nation's preferred social medium, and that winter, correspondence became a combination of literary art and survival exercise. In houses where every room was a refrigerator with wallpaper, people wrote in gloves, using breath to thaw the nib before each sentence. Stationers advertised winter ink, thicker, darker, and supposedly frost-resistant, though it mostly produced stains the colour of despair. "My pen froze twice this morning," wrote one exasperated clerk from Liverpool, and so did my resolve to answer any more correspondence. The newspapers confirmed it. Letters arrive late, frozen to the postman's satchel, declared the Daily Mirror, while the Yorkshire Herald printed this gem. A certain northern correspondent complains his ink turned to glass and cracked his inkwell. Postal workers became national heroes by default, trudging through snowdrifts with sacks of half-frozen letters, some of which arrived days later bearing small blotches of blue where the writer's fingers had clearly gone numb. Private diaries captured the ordeal with a blend of humour and resignation. One housewife in Bath recorded, "Could not clean steps, as they have vanished beneath the ice. Husband insists we shall not waste coal. I insist we shall not waste toes." Another, a schoolmaster from Kent, wrote, "Boys froze in assembly." sang hymn at double speed to preserve circulation. Entries grew shorter as the cold deepened, not from lack of thought, but because writing was physically impossible after the first paragraph. Some diarists resorted to pencil, others to shorthand. One simply scrawled, January 23rd, cold, February, sea, January. Even the upper classes, usually protected by fireplaces and denial, found their diaries turning into chronicles of inconvenience. Lady Eleanor Whitfield, a frequent contributor to the Times Society pages, wrote delicately, "The roses in the conservatory are dead, but the servants have improvised with paper blooms. Society remains brave in adversity, though my luncheon guests nearly froze to their chairs." Meanwhile, an anonymous letter to the Illustrated London News described a dinner party in Belgravia, where the soup was congealed before the second course, and a lady's fan adhered to the table by frost. Wartime stoicism had yet to become fashionable, but Edwardian self-importance filled the gap. Newspapers filled their columns with heroic little dispatches from ordinary citizens. Mrs. F. of Camden reports breaking ice in her water jug with a hammer, or Mr. P. of Derby notes his hens refuse to lay and his pipes share their sentiment. The press adored these mini-epics, each one a reminder that Britain, though cold, was still politely suffering. The winter even rewired the art of letter writing itself. Expressions of affection grew unintentionally dramatic when written under duress. "My dearest," began one love letter preserved in the Museum of London, "my hand trembles from the chill, not emotion, though both may kill me." Some letters included actual frost stains where moisture from the writer's breath had frozen on the page. A farmer from Yorkshire sent a note to his cousin simply reading, "If this arrives, know that I still live. If it does not, it was the ink's fault." Meanwhile, journalists turned poetic in their misery. The Manchester Guardian described the fog as so thick it seemed solid enough to climb. A columnist for Punch magazine complained, "The Empire's pipes have burst, its trains have halted, but its optimism remains solid, like everything else." Humour, as always, was Britain's thermal insulation. Even abroad, the Empire's correspondents weren't spared. A dispatch from an army post in India noted, "The officers complain of chill mornings and have taken to wearing sweaters. The locals find this amusing." In Canada, one letter to London ended mid-sentence, with the postscript scrawled diagonally across the page. "Ink frozen, finishing by pences, may the next mail bring spring." Postcards also became unintentional comedy. Many showed idyllic snow scenes captioned, "A merry winter to you," though the sender's messages often told another story. One survivor from Brighton scrawled beneath his postcard, "Wish I were in this picture. The snow looks warmer than my house." Yet for all the misery, there was something strangely touching in these frozen fragments of communication. The effort to keep writing, to maintain connection through ink and paper, when even words could freeze, spoke volumes about Edwardian stubbornness. People didn't stop recording their lives simply because their pens turned into icicles. They found ways. They warmed their ink pots over candles, wrote by firelight, and blew on every line like it was a newborn chick. When spring finally arrived, many diaries ended abruptly, not because life improved, but because warmth left nothing new to say. The drama had thawed. The pages that survive remain a testament to the season that almost silenced a nation, but didn't quite. Ink may have frozen, but irony, humour, and British resolve never did. In the end, the winter of 1908 wrote its own story. Not in official reports or grand declarations, but in small, forged lines of humanity, shaky signatures, half-finished letters, and sentences abandoned mid-word when frost triumphed over thought. Because sometimes history doesn't need eloquence, just a pen, a pulse, and a promise to keep writing, even when the ink decides otherwise. By the time the spring of 1908 finally stumbled into Britain, it felt less like a change of season and more like divine intervention. The endless frost began to loosen its grip, the ice sighed into water, and the nation collectively celebrated by remembering what their toes felt like. Birds returned, pipes burst, and an entire empire realised that melting could be just as dramatic as freezing. The thaw didn't arrive gracefully. It came with all the subtlety of a broken dam. Rivers that had been solid for months suddenly discovered motion again violently. Ice sheets cracked apart with gunshot sounds, rushing downstream like vengeful spirits of winter. The Thames swelled until its banks groaned, and newspapers reported floating icebergs in London, as though the capital had developed polar ambitions. In small towns, the sound of dripping gutters became a national anthem. Cheerful, rhythmic, and occasionally catastrophic, people poured into the streets in cautious celebration, watching icicles crash from rooftops like daggers of farewell. Shopkeepers flung open doors to air out the frost, and children poked at melting snowmen, half delighted, half mourning their collapse. After months of muffled silence, the world suddenly made noise again. Sloshing boots, gurgling drains, birds singing with unearned enthusiasm. Even the horses seemed livelier, though most still regarded puddles with suspicion. But nature's mercy came with a bill. The thaw turned roads into rivers and fields into bogs. Villages that had endured the freeze now drowned in the melt. The Manchester Courier reported whole lanes submerged, and one unfortunate headline declared, "Frost's revenge, now we swim." Sewers overflowed, basements filled with what the polite press called unspecified water, and laundresses found themselves washing clothes that hadn't even been worn yet. The air, once so crisp and clean, grew heavy with mud, mould, and the unmistakable smell of rot waking up from its nap. The working class, who had survived winter on rationed coal and sheer willpower, now faced a different disaster. Repair season. Roofs leaked, floors buckled, and chimneys, cracked from months of frost, collapsed with perfect timing. Carpenters, masons, and roofers suddenly became the most popular people in Britain. Advertisements in the Daily Mail offered post-frost renovations and mildew cures, while opportunistic merchants sold mops at scandalous prices. In rural areas, the countryside looked as though it had lost an argument with gravity. Meltwater coursed through fields, sweeping away fences and occasionally the odd chicken. Farmers cursed joyously, for at least cursing meant they weren't freezing. Livestock stumbled through mud with the dazed expressions of creatures rediscovering what grass used to look like. For the first time in months, milk didn't freeze solid on the way to market, though it occasionally arrived diluted by accident of geography. The middle class treated the thaw like a long-awaited social event. Gardeners emerged, blinking, to inspect what had survived beneath the frost. "The roses are dead," one lady sighed, "but so mercifully are the weeds." Windows that had been sealed for months were finally cracked open, letting in a breeze that smelled of wet optimism. Drawing rooms echoed with the sound of spring cleaning, which in Edwardian terms meant stirring up centuries of dust and politely blaming it on the servants. The rich, naturally, returned from their winter cures on the Riviera, pretending they'd endured the ordeal alongside everyone else. They stepped off trains with tanned faces and complained about the dreadful floods, as though empathy were an accessory. Their letters to friends spoke of renewal, rebirth, and Paris fashions inspired by the thaw, because nothing says recovery like silk in pastel shades. In cities, the thaw also revealed what winter had hidden. The snow that once made everything look picturesque now melted into a revelation of filth. Streets turned into grey rivers, carrying away everything the people had conveniently forgotten existed. Horse droppings, garbage, and the collective sins of January. The Pall Mall Gazette described it delicately as the less romantic side of spring. Boots were ruined, tempers shortened, and yet no one complained too loudly. The alternative was worse. Public health officials, however, weren't celebrating. They worried about frost-borne fevers, the delightful Edwardian phrase for diseases that followed when thawed refuse met running water. Hospitals filled with patients suffering from everything from influenza relapses to sewer lung. Doctors prescribed rest, tonics, and the old reliable cure, fresh air, now available in slightly less solid form. Yet despite the mud, the mess, and the smell, there was joy in the thaw. Simple joys mostly. Hearing birds again, washing sheets without breaking them, stepping outside without turning into sculpture. Markets reopened, laughter returned, and theatres played to packed houses of people desperate to feel alive again. The English spring, wrote one columnist, is like being kissed by a stranger, cold, wet, and oddly thrilling. In London, the first public park walks of the season became spontaneous celebrations. Couples strolled arm in arm beneath dripping trees, pretending not to notice the mud climbing up their boots. Children splashed in puddles with religious fervour. Even Parliament, always eager to appear seasonal, declared the thaw a sign of national resilience, though cynics noted it was more likely a sign of physics. By April, the frost was gone, but its memory lingered. People spoke of it for years afterward, as if surviving had earned them a medal. The winter of 1908, they would say proudly, that was a cold one. And then they'd tell stories of frozen pipes, of fires that refused to light, of neighbours who shared coal and gossip in equal measure. The cold had tested everyone, and somehow most had passed, if not gracefully then stubbornly. When the first wildflowers bloomed, Britain exhaled for good. The Great Freeze was over, the fires burned lower, the coats came off, and the Empire's collective mood defrosted at last. People talked about summer plans, picnics, seaside trips, gardens, as though the frost had been an exaggerated rumour. But in every village, every city street, every damp and newly green field, the thaw had left behind one undeniable truth. It's easy to romanticize winter once you've survived it. And so the Edwardians did what they did best. They smiled, carried on, and declared the entire ordeal character building. After all, nothing says triumph quite like stepping through a puddle and feeling all 10 toes again. When the frost of 1908 finally retreated into history, it didn't just leave behind cracked pipes and waterlogged boots, it left an education. Britain had survived the long freeze by wit, stubbornness, and several near-fatal encounters with makeshift fires, and the experience changed the nation in ways no sermon or government report ever could. The Edwardians learned many lessons that winter about architecture, industry, social duty, and perhaps most importantly, about the limits of human optimism. The real takeaway: invest in central heating before history repeats itself. At the dawn of the 20th century, Britain liked to believe it was modern. Electric lights glowed, trains sped across the landscape, and optimism was practically a national export. Yet the Great Freeze revealed that underneath all that progress, most of the country was still built like a medieval refrigerator. The elegant terraced homes that lined Edwardian cities might have looked genteel, but they were masterpieces of inefficiency. Single brick walls, draughty sash windows, and chimneys that inhaled more heat than they exhaled. When the temperature plunged, civilization quite literally cracked. In the aftermath, architects and engineers began to rethink what a modern home meant. The new buzzword was insulation, a word that until 1908, most Britons had associated with wrapping themselves in extra wool. Builders experimented with cavity walls and new materials like corkboard and linoleum, which, according to one enthusiast, keeps the chill out and the feet in. The arts and crafts movement, which had spent years preaching about beauty and craftsmanship, suddenly found itself competing with the emerging cult of practicality. A lovely carved lintel was nice, yes, but so was a ceiling that didn't grow icicles. Coal shortages during the freeze also exposed the fragility of the Empire's energy system. For decades, Britain had taken its black gold for granted. Mines supplied factories, factories powered fortunes, and fortunes kept fireplaces roaring. But when snow choked the railways and coal prices tripled, even the wealthy began to wonder whether endless dependence on soot might not be sustainable. Newspapers called for better storage depots, more efficient furnaces, and a national energy policy, though most citizens would have settled for coal that actually burns. Manufacturers took note. The years following the freeze saw a quiet revolution in domestic heating. Gas companies marketed new stoves with thermostats. Science in service of comfort, and inventors tinkered with portable radiators, electric heaters, and elaborate heat-distributing ducts that were the ancestors of modern central heating. In 1908, the concept of warming an entire house evenly sounded like fantasy. By the 1920s, it was a status symbol. The frozen winter had done what decades of marketing could not: convince Britons that comfort was not moral weakness, but modern necessity. The experience also altered attitudes toward urban design. The cramped tenements and back-to-back housing that had turned cities into iceboxes became a moral scandal. Reformers used the freeze as proof that poor living conditions were not just unpleasant but dangerous. A nation that can't keep its children warm, thundered one social commentator, has no right to call itself civilized. This rhetoric fueled housing reform movements, leading to the creation of model estates with wider windows, thicker walls, and, miracle of miracles, built-in fireplaces that actually heated more than a single chair. Public buildings followed suit. Schools began installing radiators instead of faith. Hospitals added better ventilation, and even railway stations invested in covered waiting areas to prevent passengers from becoming popsicles between trains. The notion that architecture could shape health gained real traction. The winter of 1908 became the unintentional godfather of British building codes, proving that good design wasn't just about elegance, it was about survival. Technology wasn't the only realm transformed. The social consciousness of the nation shifted too. The stark contrast between drawing room comfort and street corner suffering had been impossible to ignore. Charity drives during the freeze had revealed both the generosity and the limitations of private benevolence. By spring, the conversation had changed. The poor needed not handouts but protection, fair wages, better housing, and reliable utilities. The cold had shown that poverty wasn't just a moral failing, it was a thermal condition. Out of that realization grew a broader sense of civic responsibility that would decades later feed into social welfare reforms. Even fashion adapted. After that legendary winter, designers quietly began prioritizing warmth alongside glamour. Wool became patriotic. Tailors developed heavier fabrics that allowed one to survive January without resembling a rolled carpet. Fur trimmings, thermal linings, and new waterproof boots became standard for anyone who could afford them. For everyone else, the lesson was simpler. Layer until you resemble a respectable onion. Culturally, the Great Freeze left an enduring mark on Edwardian identity. The newspapers mythologized it for years afterward, celebrating the spirit of 1908, that peculiar blend of suffering and smugness. Plays and novels used it as shorthand for endurance. Postcards showed snow-covered London with captions like, "Our winter courage." It became a shared memory that united classes, even as it highlighted their differences. The winter, in short, became Britain's favourite kind of trauma, the sort you could eventually brag about. And then there were the scientists, meteorologists, who had spent much of the season dodging blame, emerged eager to redeem themselves. They pushed for better data collection, standardised weather stations, and an official meteorological service that might predict the next disaster before everyone's pipes froze again. By the 1910s, weather forecasting had improved enough that future generations could at least see their misery coming. Looking back, the winter of 1908 was both catastrophe and catalyst. It humbled an empire convinced of its own invincibility, and reminded its citizens that progress meant nothing if you couldn't keep warm in February. The Edwardians, to their credit, took the hint. They built smarter homes, demanded fairer cities, and began to treat warmth not as indulgence but as infrastructure. Still, history being what it is, the lesson occasionally required repeating. Every generation since has faced its own version of the chill, whether economic, social, or meteorological, and somewhere, in the echoes of 1908, a quiet voice still reminds them, don't just survive the cold, outthink it. Because as the Edwardians learned the hard way, civilization isn't defined by how beautifully you freeze, it's defined by how intelligently you thaw.